Carl Jung explained, 9 hidden reasons why helping others leaves empaths hated and misunderstood. Jung discovered something that terrified him so much he almost didn't publish it. It wasn't about mental illness, it wasn't about dreams or archetypes. It was about the people who help others the most, the compassionate ones, the empaths, the healers, and why they become the most hated, the most misunderstood, the most viciously attacked by the very people they serve. This violated everything Jung had been taught, everything society tells us about goodness and karma, and what goes around comes around. Because here's what he found in his clinical practice, documented in case after case, patient after patient. The more profoundly he helped someone, the more likely they were to turn against him, not despite the help, because of it. The patients who experienced the deepest breakthroughs, the ones who wept in gratitude, who said he'd saved their lives, who called him a miracle worker, these were the ones who later accused him of manipulation, of having ulterior motives, of being a fraud. Some turned entire communities against him. Some spread vicious rumors. Some sued him. And Jung realized this wasn't personal. This was archetypal. He had stumbled onto one of the most dangerous patterns in human psychology, a pattern that's been destroying empaths, healers, and helpers for thousands of years. A pattern that's destroying them right now, maybe even destroying you, because if you're watching this video, there's a high probability you're one of them, one of the rare individuals who feels others' pain as your own, who sees the wounds beneath people's masks, who can't walk past suffering without trying to heal it. And if you are, you've probably noticed something devastating. The more you help, the more you're resented. The more you give, the more you're taken from. The more compassionate you are, the more you're accused of having an agenda. Your friends call you when they're in crisis, but disappear when you need support. Your family drains you emotionally, but criticizes your boundaries. Strangers open up to you in grocery store lines, and you carry their pain home like radiation you can't wash off. You've become everyone's free therapist, everyone's emotional dumping ground, everyone's crisis hotline, and the gratitude you once received has curdled into something else, something darker, resentment, suspicion, even hatred. This is the empath's paradox, and Jung spent decades trying to understand it. What he discovered will fundamentally change how you see your gift and your curse. He found that empaths aren't hated despite their helping, they're hated because of it. And the mechanism behind this hatred is one of the most disturbing discoveries in psychological history. Because empathy, when unconscious, when you're helping from wounds you haven't healed, from needs you won't admit, from motives you can't see, becomes a weapon. A weapon that wounds both the giver and the receiver. It activates something Jung called the shadow, the disowned darkness in both people, the parts we've exiled from consciousness because they're too ugly, too shameful, too threatening to our self-image. When you help someone, you don't just ease their pain. You witness their weakness. You see them at their most broken, most vulnerable, most pathetic. And the human psyche cannot tolerate this. The ego, that fragile construction of who we think we are, will do anything to deny its own weakness, to maintain the illusion of control and strength and autonomy. So it performs a dark magic trick called projection. It takes the shame of being helped, the humiliation of being weak, the rage at being vulnerable, and it projects all of that onto you. Suddenly, you're the problem, you're the manipulator, you're the one with the agenda. The person you helped transforms you from savior into scapegoat. And if you're an unconscious empath, if you're helping from your own unhealed wounds, if you're giving to prove your worth, if you're saving others to avoid facing yourself, then you become the perfect target for this projection. Because deep down, part of you does have an agenda. Part of you is manipulating. part of you needs them to need you. You just haven't admitted it yet. This is what Jung called the wounded healer archetype, and it's one of the most dangerous psychological positions a human being can occupy, because wounded healers don't just help others, they absorb others' darkness. They become receptacles for the collective shadow, all the rage, shame, fear, and hatred that society refuses to acknowledge. They become scapegoats, literally, the goat that carries the sins of the tribe into the wilderness to die. And most empaths have no idea this is happening to them. They think they're just being kind, just being compassionate, just doing what comes naturally. But Jung discovered that what comes naturally to empaths is actually a survival mechanism forged in childhood trauma, a learned behavior disguised as a gift, a compulsion masquerading as choice. And until you become conscious of this pattern, until you integrate what Jung called your shadow and individuate into wholeness, you will continue to be hated, drained, betrayed, and destroyed by the very act of helping others. This video will reveal the 9 hidden psychological reasons why this happens. We're going to explore Jung's most forbidden insights about empathy, shadow projection, and the dark side of compassion. We'll examine real cases, including Jung's own near-psychotic breakdown when he absorbed too much of his patient's darkness, and we'll provide the path Jung himself walked to transform from wounded helper to conscious healer. But I need to warn you, this journey requires brutal honesty. You're going to have to face things about yourself that you've been avoiding, motives you won't want to admit, patterns you've justified for years. You're going to have to confront the possibility that your helping isn't as pure as you thought, that your compassion might be contaminated with need, that your empathy might be a cage you've built for yourself. This is shadow work, and it's not pretty, but it's the only path to freedom, the only way to transform from a wounded healer who's devoured by others' darkness into a sovereign servant who can genuinely transmute suffering. So if you're ready to see the truth about empathy, the forbidden truth that Jung almost took to his grave, then keep watching, because what you're about to learn will either destroy you or liberate you. There is no middle ground. Let me tell you about a psychological condition so rare that most therapists go their entire careers without properly identifying it. Jung called it the wounded healer archetype. And if you're an empath, there's a high probability you're suffering from it right now without even knowing it. Here's how it works. Most empaths believe their gift is innate, something they were born with, a natural sensitivity to others' emotions, a heightened perception of pain, an instinctive drive to help and heal. But Jung discovered something that completely inverts this narrative. Empathy isn't a gift you're born with. It's a survival mechanism you developed in response to childhood trauma. Let me explain. Children who grow up in emotionally volatile, unpredictable, or dysfunctional environments learn very quickly that survival depends on one skill above all others: reading the room. You learn to scan your mother's face for micro-expressions that signal whether she's about to explode or collapse. You learn to feel your father's mood shifts before he even enters the house. You learn to detect tension in the air like an animal sensing a predator. This isn't empathy, this is hypervigilance, a trauma response. But it doesn't feel like trauma, it feels like a superpower, because the child who develops this skill becomes invaluable to the dysfunctional family system. They become the emotional thermostat, the mediator, the peacekeeper, the one who soothes everyone else's pain so the whole structure doesn't collapse, and they receive something precious in return: validation, love, a sense of purpose, a role that makes them feel special, important, needed. Their entire identity gets built around this role. I'm the one who helps. I'm the one who understands. I'm the one who makes everything okay. But here's the devastating part. This role is a cage. Because you never learned to have needs of your own. Never learned that your emotions matter. Never learned that you're worthy of care even when you're not being useful. Your worth became conditional on your ability to ease others' suffering, and so you carried this pattern into adulthood, seeking out relationships, careers, and situations where you could replay this familiar dynamic. You became the friend everyone calls in crisis, but nobody checks on, the therapist who can't say no to another client even though you're drowning, the activist who absorbs the world's pain until you're suicidal, the parent who sacrifices everything for your children and wonders why they resent you. This is wounded healer syndrome, and it operates on a logic that's completely invisible to the person suffering from it. The logic goes like this: if I help others, I'm valuable. If I'm valuable, I'm safe. If I'm safe, I can avoid facing the gaping wound inside me that's been there since childhood. The wound that whispers, I'm fundamentally unworthy of love unless I'm being useful. So you give and give and give, not from abundance, from deficit. You're trying to fill your own void by filling everyone else's, trying to heal your own wound by healing theirs, trying to prove your worth by becoming indispensable, but it doesn't work. Because helping from woundedness isn't helping, it's a transaction, an unconscious exchange where you're secretly hoping that if you save them, they'll save you back. And when they don't, when they take your help and disappear, or worse, turn against you, you feel betrayed, victimized, confused. How could they do this to me after everything I've done for them? But Jung would ask you a harder question. What were you really doing it for? Were you helping because it genuinely served them? Or because you needed to be needed? Because your identity depends on being the helper? Because if you stop giving, you'll have to face the emptiness inside? This is the shadow side of empathy that nobody talks about. The unconscious manipulation, the martyr complex, the hidden contract where you give in order to get. And the most painful part, the people you help can feel this. They might not be able to articulate it. They might not even be consciously aware of it. But somewhere deep in their psyche, they sense the strings attached to your compassion. They feel the weight of your unspoken expectation, the pressure of your need for them to need you, the subtle superiority in your helping that implies they're broken and you're the one who's whole, and it makes them want to destroy you. This is what Jung meant when he said that wounded healers become targets of projection. You're not being hated for your goodness. You're being hated because your goodness isn't as clean as you think it is. It's contaminated with your own unmet needs, your own unhealed trauma, your own unconscious attempt to control others through caretaking. And on some level, they can smell it. Modern psychology has validated everything Jung discovered about this pattern. Research on codependency shows that chronic helpers score high on measures of low self-worth, fear of abandonment, and difficulty accessing their own emotions. They've learned to regulate themselves through regulating others, which is exactly what Jung described. Studies on compassion fatigue reveal that helpers who lack boundaries, who can't say no, who feel guilty for prioritizing themselves, inevitably burn out. Their compassion isn't sustainable because it's not coming from a full cup. It's coming from an empty one. Neuroscience has discovered that people who engage in compulsive helping actually show similar brain patterns to people with addiction. The act of helping triggers dopamine release, creating a neurochemical reward cycle. They're literally addicted to being needed. And trauma research confirms Jung's observation that most chronic helpers have adverse childhood experiences, emotional neglect, parentification, role reversal, or growing up in environments where their value was conditional on their usefulness. Your empathy isn't a gift, it's a symptom of a wound that hasn't healed, a trauma pattern that hasn't been integrated, a survival mechanism that's outlived its usefulness. And until you recognize this, until you do the brutal shadow work of admitting why you really help people, you will continue to experience the empath's paradox. You'll continue to give until you're empty. Continue to absorb others' pain until you're toxic. Continue to be resented, betrayed, and hated by the people you're trying to save. Because here's the hard truth Jung discovered: you can't save anyone. Not really. Not permanently. Not in a way that gives you the validation and worth you're desperately seeking. Every person has to individuate themselves, walk their own path, face their own shadow, do their own work. Your compulsive helping isn't serving them, it's enabling them, keeping them dependent, preventing them from developing their own strength. And it's slowly killing you. The exhaustion you feel isn't normal tiredness. It's soul-level depletion, the weight of carrying everyone else's unintegrated darkness while neglecting your own inner work. The resentment that's growing in you, that bitter feeling that nobody cares about you the way you care about them, is a symptom of the wounded healer pattern eating you alive from the inside. And the hatred you're receiving from others is their unconscious way of trying to shake you awake, to force you to see what you refuse to see, that your helping is a cage you've built for yourself, a role you're playing to avoid the terrifying work of becoming whole. This is the problem Jung identified, and the solution he discovered, which we'll explore in depth later, requires you to do something that will feel like dying. You have to stop helping, not forever, not completely, but long enough to face the question that's been haunting you since childhood. Who am I if I'm not the one who helps? That question is the gateway to individuation, and on the other side of it lies freedom. But first, you need to understand exactly how this pattern plays out in real relationships, real therapeutic encounters, real human dynamics. So let me tell you about one of Jung's most painful experiences, a case that nearly broke him and forced him to confront the full horror of the wounded healer archetype. The year was 1909, and Carl Jung was at the height of his professional success. He was Freud's chosen successor, the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association, a rising star in the new field of psychoanalysis, and he had just helped a patient achieve what he considered the most profound psychological breakthrough of his career. The patient, let's call her Anna, though Jung used a different name in his notes, had come to him suffering from what we would now call severe depression and dissociation. She had attempted suicide twice, could barely function, felt completely disconnected from her own life, like she was watching herself from outside her body. Jung worked with her intensively for 18 months. He guided her through active imagination exercises, dream analysis, confrontation with her shadow material. He helped her excavate childhood traumas she'd completely repressed, abuse, abandonment, violations she'd locked away to survive. The process was brutal. She would spend entire sessions sobbing, screaming, regressing into childlike states. Jung held space for all of it, witnessing the full depth of her brokenness with unwavering presence. And slowly, miraculously, she began to heal. She started painting again, reconnected with her body, began experiencing moments of genuine joy for the first time in years. She told Jung he'd saved her life, that he was the first person who'd ever truly seen her, that she loved him, not romantically, but with the fierce devotion of someone who'd been pulled back from the abyss. Jung felt deeply satisfied. This was why he'd become a therapist. This was the work that mattered. He had helped someone transform from suicidal despair to authentic aliveness. Or so he thought. 6 months after their sessions ended, Anna began spreading rumors about Jung in Zurich's intellectual circles. She told people he'd manipulated her, taken advantage of her vulnerability, used questionable therapeutic techniques that bordered on abuse. She claimed he'd encouraged an unhealthy dependence on him, then abandoned her when she needed him most. None of it was true. Jung had maintained impeccable professional boundaries, had carefully prepared her for the ending of their therapeutic relationship, had done everything by the book. But the damage was done. Colleagues began questioning his methods. Patients canceled appointments. His reputation, so carefully built, began to crack. And the most devastating part? Anna wasn't lying intentionally. She genuinely believed what she was saying. In her mind, Jung had somehow victimized her. The gratitude she'd felt had transformed into suspicion, then resentment, then outright hatred. Jung was bewildered, hurt, furious. He had given this woman everything: his time, his expertise, his emotional labor, his genuine care. He had witnessed her at her most broken and never judged her. He had believed in her healing when she couldn't believe in it herself. And this was his reward? Character assassination? Public humiliation? For weeks he spiraled, questioned everything, wondered if he should give up therapeutic work entirely. But then something shifted. Jung began to see the pattern. This wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It had occurred in milder forms with other patients. The ones who'd experienced the deepest breakthroughs were often the ones who eventually turned cold, distant, even hostile. And Jung realized this wasn't personal. This was archetypal. He started researching historical parallels, and he found them everywhere. Jesus healing the sick and feeding the poor, crucified by the very people he served. Socrates offering wisdom freely, forced to drink hemlock by his own city. Prophets rejected in their hometowns. Healers burned as witches. Shamans exiled from their tribes. The pattern was ancient, universal, embedded in the collective unconscious, and the psychological mechanism behind it was something Jung would spend the rest of his life trying to understand. Here's what he discovered. When you help someone heal, you don't just ease their suffering. You witness their complete vulnerability. You see them at their absolute worst, broken, desperate, powerless. In that moment, they're exposed, raw, naked in a way that has nothing to do with physical nakedness and everything to do with psychic nakedness. And for the ego, that fragile structure of self-image and identity, this is unbearable, because the ego's primary function is to maintain the illusion of control, strength, autonomy, to believe, I am the author of my life, I am in charge, I am not weak. But being helped shatters that illusion. It proves you were weak. You weren't in control. You needed someone else to save you, and the person who helped you becomes living evidence of your former powerlessness. Every time you see them, you're reminded of how broken you were, how pathetic you felt, how utterly dependent you became. The psyche cannot tolerate this, so it performs what Jung called enantiodromia, the flip into the opposite. Gratitude becomes resentment. Love becomes hatred. The savior becomes the villain. The person you helped must destroy you psychologically, socially, reputationally, in order to reclaim their power and deny their former weakness. It's not conscious, it's not malicious, it's an automatic defense mechanism of the ego trying to restore equilibrium. They don't hate you for helping them, they hate you for knowing them, for witnessing their shadow, for having seen them at their most helpless. And they project all that shame, all that rage, all that humiliation onto you. You manipulated me. You took advantage of me. You wanted me to be dependent on you. In their revised narrative, they weren't weak. You were predatory. They weren't helpless. You were controlling. They weren't saved. You were the danger they needed to escape. This rewrite is necessary for the ego to maintain its coherence. But for the helper, it's devastating, because you genuinely cared. You genuinely helped. You gave everything you had, and now you're being demonized for it. Jung realized this is why wounded healers burn out, why therapists leave the profession, why activists become bitter, why empaths eventually shut down, because helping others from a wounded place sets up an impossible dynamic. You're unconsciously hoping your help will earn you love, validation, gratitude, the things you didn't get in childhood. You're trying to prove your worth through your usefulness, but the very act of helping creates a power imbalance that will eventually be resented. And when the resentment comes, when you're rejected and betrayed despite your best efforts, it confirms your deepest wound. See, I'm not actually worthy of love. Even when I give everything, it's not enough. I'm fundamentally unlovable. This is the wounded healer trap. You help others to prove you're worthy, but helping creates resentment. The resentment confirms your unworthiness, so you help more desperately to compensate, which creates more resentment, which confirms your unworthiness, and on in a downward spiral. Anna's betrayal forced Jung to see this pattern in himself. He realized he hadn't just been helping her, he'd been unconsciously using her healing to validate his own worth as a therapist, to prove he was special, to inflate his ego with the identity of healer. He'd needed her to need him, and when she didn't anymore, when she individuated and became her own authority, part of him felt threatened, not consciously, but in his shadow, and she had sensed that. Somewhere deep in her psyche, she'd felt the invisible strings attached to his compassion, the subtle pressure of his need to be needed. And she'd reacted by cutting those strings violently, by destroying the image of him as her savior. This realization devastated Jung, but it also liberated him, because once he saw the pattern, he could work with it consciously. He began doing something radical. He stopped trying to help his patients, not in the sense of abandoning them, but in the sense of releasing his attachment to their healing, his need for them to get better, to validate his worth as a therapist. He started telling patients directly, I can't save you. Only you can save yourself. I'm here to witness, to guide, to hold space, but the work is yours. This created a completely different therapeutic dynamic. Patients could no longer project savior fantasies onto him because he refused to play that role. They couldn't later resent him for having power over them because he made it clear from the beginning that the power was always theirs. And paradoxically, his therapeutic outcomes improved. Because when you help from wholeness rather than woundedness, when you serve without attachment to being seen as the savior, you create space for genuine transformation. The person doesn't become dependent on you. They become dependent on their own inner resources, which is the only kind of healing that lasts. But Jung also discovered something darker. He found that certain people don't want genuine healing. They want a savior they can eventually crucify. They're unconsciously seeking someone to project their shadow onto, someone to blame for their suffering, someone to destroy so they can feel powerful. And empaths, with their compulsive need to help, make perfect targets. Because empaths will tolerate abuse longer than anyone else. They'll excuse it, rationalize it, take responsibility for it. They'll keep giving even when they're being devoured. They think they're being compassionate, but they're actually being used. Jung learned to identify these people, what we might now call narcissists or psychological vampires, and he learned to say no to them, not with cruelty, but with clear, firm boundaries. I cannot help you because you don't genuinely want help. You want a savior to later crucify, and I refuse to play that role. This ability to discern, to distinguish between people who genuinely want to transform and people who want a scapegoat, became one of Jung's most important skills. And it's a skill most empaths never develop, because they believe saying no is cruel, that everyone deserves help, that if they just give more, love more, sacrifice more, eventually the person will change. But Jung discovered that this belief is a form of inflation, of playing God, of believing you have the power to save someone who doesn't want to be saved, and it always ends in disaster. Anna's betrayal taught Jung that helping others is one of the most dangerous psychological activities a human can engage in, because it activates shadow material in both people. It creates power dynamics that will eventually destabilize. It sets up projections that will later need to be destroyed. And if you're doing it from an unconscious, wounded place, if you're helping to prove your worth, to avoid your own pain, to maintain the identity of savior, you will be devoured by the very people you're trying to save. This is the archetypal pattern Jung discovered, and it's been repeating for thousands of years, destroying helpers and healers in every generation. But Jung also discovered that this pattern isn't inevitable. There is a way to help others without being destroyed, a way to serve without being devoured, a way to maintain genuine compassion without falling into the wounded healer trap. But it requires you to first become whole yourself, to integrate your shadow, to heal your wounds, to individuate into sovereignty. And that process begins with understanding the modern research that validates everything Jung discovered. Research that proves the empath's paradox is real, measurable, and scientifically documented. Jung's observations about help rejection weren't just clinical intuition. They were describing a real psychological phenomenon that modern science has now measured, quantified, and validated. And the research is disturbing because it proves that receiving help can actually threaten a person's sense of self, triggering defense mechanisms that range from resentment to outright aggression toward the helper. Let me show you the data. In 2018, researchers at the University of Pennsylvania conducted a groundbreaking study on what they called autonomy threat in help-seeking relationships. They found that when people receive help, especially help they didn't explicitly request, their brains show activation in areas associated with threat detection and shame processing. The amygdala lights up, cortisol levels spike, the body goes into a mild fight-or-flight response, not because the help itself is harmful, but because being helped challenges a person's self-concept as competent, independent, and in control. The researchers called this self-threat through help reception, and they found it was especially pronounced in people with fragile self-esteem, strong independence values, or narcissistic tendencies. In other words, the people who need help most are often the ones most likely to resent the helper. This explains Jung's observation perfectly. Anna needed his help desperately, but receiving it so profoundly threatened her ego that she had to reconstruct the narrative to preserve her self-image. Other studies have documented what researchers call gratitude aversion, the psychological discomfort people experience when they feel indebted to someone who helped them. A 2020 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that approximately 35% of help recipients reported feeling worse about themselves after receiving assistance. Even when the help was genuinely beneficial, they felt diminished, weak, obligated, trapped in a debt they could never repay. And this psychological debt creates what researchers call reactance, a defensive response where people rebel against feeling controlled or obligated. They start criticizing the helper, finding flaws in the assistance, minimizing the value of what was given, eventually convincing themselves the helper had ulterior motives. It's a subconscious attempt to erase the debt by devaluing the help and demonizing the helper. This is exactly what Jung observed with Anna. The gratitude she initially felt became unbearable, a weight of obligation she couldn't carry. So her psyche performed a trick. If Jung was actually manipulative, then she didn't owe him anything. In fact, he owed her an apology. The debt was erased through narrative revision. But the research gets even darker. Studies on moral licensing reveal that people who receive help often feel entitled to treat the helper badly as a way of rebalancing the moral scales. A 2019 study showed that help recipients were more likely to engage in selfish or aggressive behavior toward their helper compared to neutral parties, as if punishing the helper for making them feel indebted. The logic is unconscious but clear. You made me feel weak by helping me. Now I'm entitled to make you feel bad to restore my sense of power. This is the shadow side of helping that empaths never anticipate. They think help creates gratitude, but it often creates resentment disguised as gratitude, a resentment that will eventually erupt. Neuroscience has even identified the brain mechanisms behind this. When we're helped, especially in ways that highlight our inadequacy, the posterior cingulate cortex, associated with self-referential processing, shows decreased activity, while the anterior insula, associated with negative emotional states, shows increased activity. In plain English, receiving help can diminish your sense of self while increasing feelings of shame, anxiety, and social pain. The helper becomes associated with those negative feelings, and the brain starts tagging them as a threat to be avoided or eliminated. Research on tall poppy syndrome provides another piece of the puzzle. Studies across multiple cultures have documented a universal human tendency to cut down high achievers, especially those who display moral superiority or exceptional altruism. A 2017 Australian study found that people who were perceived as too helpful or too selfless were more likely to be socially punished, excluded, gossiped about, undermined, than people who maintained average levels of pro-social behavior. The researchers concluded that extreme altruism triggers suspicion and resentment because it implicitly condemns everyone else as less moral. When you help others consistently, you're inadvertently positioning yourself as morally superior, and human groups have an ancient tribal instinct to destroy anyone who seems to be claiming higher status through virtue. This is why empaths get betrayed. They're not just helping, they're threatening the social hierarchy by being too good. The research on empathic burnout validates Jung's observation that wounded healers eventually collapse under the weight of others' darkness. Studies show that healthcare workers, therapists, social workers, anyone in a chronic helping role, experience secondary traumatic stress at rates comparable to primary trauma victims. They absorb their clients' PTSD, anxiety, depression. Their mirror neurons fire constantly, creating vicarious emotional experiences that accumulate like radiation exposure. A 2021 meta-analysis found that 75% of helping professionals met clinical criteria for compassion fatigue. They were emotionally depleted, physically exhausted, spiritually empty. But here's the critical finding. The helpers who maintained boundaries, who had regular self-care practices, who could say no without guilt, they didn't burn out. The ones who collapsed were the ones Jung would have identified as wounded healers, the ones helping from deficit rather than abundance, the ones who couldn't stop giving because their entire identity depended on being needed. Research on codependency confirms this pattern. Studies show that chronic helpers score high on measures of low self-worth, fear of abandonment, and external locus of control. They regulate their anxiety by taking care of others, which provides temporary relief but reinforces the core wound. They're trapped in what researchers call a compulsive caregiving cycle that mirrors addiction patterns. Brain scans of chronic helpers show dopamine release when they engage in helping behavior, the same neurochemical reward that drives gambling, substance abuse, and other addictions. They're literally addicted to being needed, and like all addictions, it requires increasing doses to achieve the same effect. They have to help more, give more, sacrifice more, until they're completely depleted. This validates Jung's insight that unconscious helping is a symptom, not a virtue. It's a learned behavior designed to regulate the helper's own anxiety, not genuinely serve the other person. Research on childhood trauma and adult helping behavior shows clear correlations. A 2020 study found that adults who scored high on compulsive caregiving measures were significantly more likely to have experienced emotional neglect, parentification, or unstable attachment in childhood. They learned early that their worth was conditional on their usefulness, that they could earn love by taking care of others' needs while suppressing their own. This confirms Jung's observation that empathy in most cases isn't a gift. It's a trauma response that's been valorized by society. The research also validates Jung's discovery that genuine helping requires boundaries and discernment. Studies on sustainable altruism show that the most effective helpers are those who can distinguish their emotions from others' emotions, maintain clear boundaries between helping and enmeshment, feel comfortable saying no when appropriate, regularly engage in self-care without guilt, help from genuine choice rather than compulsion, don't need external validation for their helping. In other words, the most effective helpers are those who've done their own individuation work, who've healed their wounds before trying to heal others, who give from fullness rather than emptiness. But the most disturbing research finding, the one that confirms Jung's darkest observation, is this. Studies on help rejection show that the helpers most likely to be betrayed, attacked, and demonized by those they help are the ones with the strongest unconscious need to be seen as saviors. The ones who are secretly using helping to inflate their egos, to prove their worth, to maintain the identity of good person or healer or empath. The research shows that help recipients can sense this unconscious agenda. They can't articulate it, but they feel the strings attached to the compassion, the subtle coercion, the implied contract where they're supposed to provide gratitude, admiration, or continued dependence in exchange for the help, and they rebel against it. Sometimes violently. This is why Jung's patient Anna turned against him. She sensed, correctly, that his helping wasn't as clean as he thought. That part of him needed her to need him. That his identity as great healer depended on patients like her having dramatic breakthroughs. She couldn't articulate this consciously, but her psyche knew, and it rejected him to break free from the invisible cage his unconscious needs had built around her. The research proves Jung was right. Helping others is psychologically dangerous, not because helping is inherently harmful, but because most people who compulsively help others are doing it for unconscious reasons they refuse to examine. They're using others' pain to avoid their own, using others' healing to prove their own worth, using others' dependence to fill their own emptiness. And the people being helped can feel this. They sense the manipulation hidden inside the compassion, the neediness disguised as generosity, the control masquerading as care. And they eventually turn on the helper, not because they're ungrateful, but because they're trying to free themselves from an unconscious dynamic that was never about genuine service. This research validates everything Jung discovered through clinical observation, but it also points toward Jung's solution, which we'll explore in depth later. Because the data shows that conscious helpers, those who've integrated their shadow, healed their wounds, and established firm boundaries, don't trigger these negative reactions. They don't burn out. They don't get betrayed. They don't become targets of projection, because they're helping from a fundamentally different place, from wholeness rather than woundedness, from genuine service rather than compulsive need. But before we can explore that solution, you need to understand the full scope of the empath's paradox. You need to see the 9 specific psychological mechanisms that cause empaths to be hated, the hidden reasons that operate beneath conscious awareness, destroying helpers in every generation. These are the patterns Jung identified, the archetypal dynamics that have been repeating for thousands of years. And if you're an empath, you need to know which ones are operating in your life right now. Because until you can see these patterns clearly, you can't break free from them. Now we come to the core of Jung's discovery, the 9 archetypal patterns that cause empaths to be hated, misunderstood, and destroyed by the very people they try to help. These aren't just psychological theories, they're documented patterns Jung observed repeatedly across his clinical practice, his personal life, and his study of mythology, religion, and history. Each pattern operates unconsciously, both in the empath and in the people they help. And each pattern creates a specific dynamic that inevitably leads to resentment, betrayal, or rejection. Let me reveal them one by one. Hidden reason. 1. The projection screen. Jung discovered that empaths have an unusual psychic quality. Their energy field is receptive, porous, almost magnetically attractive to others' unconscious material. They become what he called projection screens, blank canvases onto which others project their disowned shadow. Here's how it works. Everyone has parts of themselves they've exiled to the unconscious because they're too painful, shameful, or threatening to acknowledge. Rage, neediness, selfishness, weakness, perversion, whatever qualities violate their self-image. These disowned parts don't disappear. They accumulate in what Jung called the shadow, the dark twin of the conscious personality. And the shadow is desperate to be seen, acknowledged, integrated. But the ego refuses, so the psyche performs a trick. It projects these qualities onto other people. I'm not angry, you're angry. I'm not needy, you're the clingy one. I'm not selfish, you're the manipulator. Empaths become primary targets for these projections because of their receptive nature. They're emotionally open, highly sensitive, deeply empathetic. They don't have the same defensive armor that most people use to deflect others' psychological material. So others' shadow content lands on them, sticks to them, accumulates like psychic sludge. And here's the devastating part. Empaths often accept these projections. Someone projects their rage onto you, and instead of deflecting it, you think, maybe they're right. Maybe I am too angry. Maybe I am the problem. You absorb their disowned darkness and start believing it's yours. This is why empaths often feel confused about their own emotions. They can't tell where they end and others begin. They're carrying so much projected material they've lost touch with their authentic self. But the projection doesn't stop there. The people projecting onto you need to believe their projections are real. So they start treating you as if you actually are the qualities they've projected. If they've projected their selfishness onto you, they'll constantly accuse you of being selfish, even when you're giving everything. If they've projected their manipulativeness onto you, they'll interpret every act of kindness as having an ulterior motive. You become the scapegoat for their shadow, the repository for everything they can't acknowledge in themselves, and eventually they hate you for it, not because of who you actually are, but because you're carrying the weight of everything they despise about themselves, and they need to destroy you to symbolically destroy their own darkness. Ask yourself, do people often accuse you of qualities that don't match your actual behavior? Do you frequently feel confused about who you really are versus who others say you are? Do you attract people who seem to need a villain, and you always end up cast in that role? If yes, you're functioning as a projection screen, and it's destroying you. Hidden reason. Number 2. The debt dynamic. Jung observed that help creates psychological debt, and debt creates resentment. This is hardwired into human psychology. We're uncomfortable with owing someone something, especially something as significant as our well-being, our healing, our survival. When someone helps you, they gain a form of power over you. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but structurally. They've demonstrated superiority in a fundamental way. They had resources you needed. They were strong when you were weak. They could give what you couldn't provide for yourself. This creates an inequality that the ego finds intolerable. Research shows that the larger the help, the greater the debt, and the greater the unconscious need to escape that debt. For small favors, we can say thank you and move on. But for profound help, the kind that saves your life, heals your trauma, pulls you from the abyss, the debt feels unpayable. You can never repay someone for saving your life, can never balance the scales, can never restore equality. So the psyche looks for another solution. Devalue the help or demonize the helper. They didn't really save me. I would have figured it out myself eventually. Their help actually made things worse in some ways. They had ulterior motives. They wanted me dependent on them. Through these narrative revisions, the debt is erased. You don't owe them anything because the help wasn't genuine, wasn't that significant, or was actually harmful. Jung saw this pattern with patients who'd experienced profound breakthroughs. The greater the transformation, the more likely they were to later minimize his contribution or reframe his actions as problematic. They had to, because the alternative, living with permanent psychological debt to another human, was unbearable. Empaths trigger this dynamic constantly because they give so much. They don't give small favors, they give themselves, their time, their energy, their emotional labor, their life force. And they create massive psychological debts in others, debts that can never be repaid. So others eventually turn on them, not out of malice, but out of the desperate need to escape the weight of obligation. Ask yourself, do people often minimize or forget the help you've given them? Do relationships that start with intense gratitude often end with betrayal? Do you feel like you're always giving more than you receive, but others act like you're the one who owes them? If yes, you're trapped in the debt dynamic. And it's why you're resented. Hidden reason, 3, the mirror effect. Empaths reflect back what others don't want to see in themselves. Jung discovered that certain individuals function as psychological mirrors. Their mere presence surfaces unconscious material in others. This isn't intentional. It's not something empaths do. It's something they are. Their heightened sensitivity, their emotional depth, their ability to see through masks, these qualities create a reflection that others find disturbing. When someone is lying to themselves and you can see the truth beneath the lie, your knowing becomes a threat. When someone is hiding from their pain and your presence somehow surfaces that pain, they experience you as dangerous. When someone has built an entire identity around being fine or strong or independent, and your empathy reveals the wounded child beneath, they have to either accept that revelation or destroy the mirror. Most choose to destroy the mirror. Jung called this shadow confrontation through relationship. Certain people carry such integrated consciousness that their presence automatically triggers others' shadow material, and people hate them for it, not consciously. Most people can't articulate why they feel uncomfortable around deep empaths. They just know that being near you makes them feel seen in a way that's invasive, threatening, unsafe. You're reflecting back their own disowned parts. And instead of doing the work of integration, it's easier to push you away, villainize you, convince themselves that you're the problem. This is why empaths often experience social rejection, even when they haven't done anything wrong. Their very presence is destabilizing. They disrupt others' carefully constructed defenses just by existing. And in groups, this effect amplifies. The empath becomes the identified patient, the one who brings drama or creates problems or makes things uncomfortable. But what they're really doing is reflecting back the group's shadow, the unspoken tensions, the hidden resentments, the collective lies everyone's agreed not to acknowledge. And groups will sacrifice the mirror to avoid facing themselves. Ask yourself, do people seem uncomfortable around you even when conversations are pleasant? Do you get blamed for creating problems when you're just noticing what's already there? Do people say you're too intense or too much when you're just being authentic? If yes, you're functioning as a mirror, and people hate mirrors. Hidden reason. 4. The savior complex trigger. Here's a hard truth. When you help someone, you're implicitly communicating that they're weak, broken, or inadequate. You don't mean to. You think you're just being kind, compassionate, supportive. But the subtext of helping is always, I am capable in this area where you are not. I am strong where you are weak. I have what you lack. This is why help can feel patronizing, even when it's genuinely well-intentioned, because it establishes a hierarchy. Helper above, helped below. And most people's egos rebel against being placed in the below position. Jung discovered that the people most sensitive to this dynamic are those with fragile self-esteem or narcissistic defenses. They need to maintain the belief that they're competent, independent, in control. Your help threatens that belief. So they reject the help, not because they don't need it, but because accepting it would mean admitting weakness. And if they do accept the help in a moment of crisis, they'll later resent you for having witnessed their weakness. Empaths compound this problem because they don't just help with external problems. They see the emotional wounds beneath the surface, the vulnerability, the pain people work so hard to hide, and that kind of seeing feels like violation. You've bypassed their defenses, witnessed what they didn't consent to reveal, seen them in a way that makes them feel exposed and powerless. Even if you never speak about what you see, they know you see it. And they hate you for it, because now you have knowledge about them that they can't control. You've seen behind the mask, and that gives you power over them, power they desperately need to reclaim. So they turn on you. They reframe your helping as manipulation, your seeing as judgment, your compassion as condescension. It's the only way to restore the power balance. Ask yourself, do people often reject your help or get defensive when you offer support? Do you notice people's wounds clearly, but feel like acknowledging them would be intrusive? Do people later resent you for having seen them vulnerable? If yes, you're triggering the savior complex reaction, and it's making you a target. Hidden reason. 5. The boundary violation. Jung discovered that empaths often cross psychic boundaries without realizing it. They don't mean to be invasive, but their empathic sensitivity allows them to perceive things about others that those people haven't consciously chosen to share. You feel someone's sadness before they've acknowledged it themselves. You sense someone's anger before they've admitted it. You know someone's in crisis before they've said a word. This feels like a gift to you. You think you're being attentive, sensitive, caring, but to the other person it can feel like violation because you've entered their psychic space without permission. You've accessed information about them that they haven't consented to reveal. And when you respond to what you've sensed, when you ask, "Are you okay?" to someone who's trying to hide their pain, or offer comfort to someone who hasn't asked for it, you're essentially saying, "I see what you're trying to hide. Your defenses don't work on me." This is terrifying for most people. Everyone has parts of themselves they need to keep private, thoughts they're not ready to share, feelings they're still processing, wounds they're not ready to expose. Your empathic sensitivity bypasses their control over what gets revealed and when, and control over self-disclosure is fundamental to psychological safety. When you take that away, even with good intentions, you become a threat. Jung called this empathic intrusion, and he warned that it was one of the primary ways helpers alienate the people they're trying to serve. The empath thinks, "I'm just being sensitive to their needs." But the other person experiences, "This person is invading my boundaries, seeing things I don't want seen, forcing intimacy I haven't consented to," and they push you away. label you as intrusive, nosy, boundaryless, not because you've done anything overtly wrong, but because your psychic sensitivity itself is a boundary violation in a world where most people need thick walls to feel safe. Ask yourself, do you often sense what people are feeling before they tell you? Do people seem uncomfortable when you demonstrate how well you understand them? Do you get accused of being too intense or invasive, even when you're trying to help? If yes, you're committing empathic boundary violations, and it's why people avoid you. Hidden reason usher 6, the power imbalance. We've touched on this already, but it deserves its own recognition because it's one of the most significant factors. When you help someone, especially through a crisis or transformation, you gain power over them, not formal power, not legal power, but psychological power. You know their vulnerabilities. You've seen their weaknesses. You've witnessed them at their most broken, and that knowledge creates a permanent imbalance in the relationship. They can never unknow that you've seen them that way, can never unsee themselves through your eyes during their weakest moment. Jung observed that this imbalance is intolerable for the ego, which needs to maintain the illusion of equality in relationships. So the person you helped has 3 options. Option 1, remain in a subordinate position, forever grateful, forever indebted. This is psychologically untenable for most people. Option 2, achieve genuine equality by transforming themselves to the point where the helper's knowledge no longer represents a power differential. This requires massive personal growth that most people aren't willing to do. Option 3, destroy the power imbalance by destroying the helper's credibility, reputation, or position. This is the easiest option and the most common. By reframing you as manipulative, harmful, or untrustworthy, they eliminate your psychological power over them. If you're discredited, your knowledge of their vulnerability no longer matters. In fact, it becomes evidence of your maliciousness. They saw me vulnerable and took advantage. The power imbalance is eliminated, not through their growth, but through your destruction. This is why whistleblowers get attacked, why therapists get sued, why activists get canceled by their own movements, why empaths get betrayed by the people they've sacrificed for, because they hold knowledge of others' shadows, and that knowledge is power others need to neutralize. Ask yourself, do people often turn on you after you've helped them through something significant? Do relationships that involve you seeing someone's deep vulnerability tend to deteriorate? Do people seem to need to take you down a notch after you've been in a supportive role? If yes, the power imbalance dynamic is destroying your relationships. Hidden reason. Number 7, the martyrdom performance. Now we come to one of the shadow aspects of empathic helping, one that most empaths vehemently deny, but Jung insisted they must confront. Unconscious helping often functions as a performance of moral superiority. The empath doesn't consciously think, I'm going to help this person to prove I'm better than them. But unconsciously, the compulsive helper is using their helping to maintain a specific identity. I am the good one, the selfless one, the one who rises above pettiness and ego to serve others. And that identity carries an implicit judgment. I am morally superior to people who don't help the way I do. Jung called this inflation through identification with the archetype of the helper or healer. You start believing you are the archetype rather than just expressing it in moments. And other people can sense this inflation. They feel the subtle superiority radiating from your compassion, the unspoken comparison, the hidden message that your selflessness proves you're more evolved, more conscious, more spiritual than they are, and it makes them want to destroy you. Because your helping isn't just helping, it's a performance designed to elevate you and diminish them. Look how much I sacrifice. Look how compassionate I am. Look how I rise above my own needs to serve you. The martyrdom is a form of aggression disguised as compassion, and people rebel against it, often viciously, because they sense they're being used as props in your performance of goodness. This is one of the hardest truths for empaths to swallow, because they genuinely believe their helping is pure. But Jung would ask, then why do you feel resentful when people don't appreciate your help? Why do you keep score of your sacrifices? Why does your identity collapse when you're not in the helper role? If your helping were truly selfless, you wouldn't need recognition, wouldn't feel resentful, wouldn't make others feel indebted. The fact that you do feel these things reveals the shadow. You're using helping to prove your worth, to maintain superiority, to control how others see you. And people can feel the strings attached to your compassion. They sense they're expected to play a role in your narrative, the grateful recipient who validates your goodness. And when they refuse to play that role, when they reject your help or fail to show sufficient gratitude, you feel betrayed. But really, they're just refusing to participate in your martyrdom performance. Ask yourself, do you feel resentful when your help isn't appreciated? Do you sometimes think about how much you've sacrificed in a way that feels like keeping score? Do you feel superior to people who are more selfish or less helpful? Does your sense of identity depend heavily on being seen as compassionate or selfless? If yes, you're performing martyrdom, and people hate the performance. Hidden reason, Shur 8, the vicarious shadow. Jung discovered that empaths don't just absorb others' emotions. They absorb others' shadow material, the disowned darkness, the unexpressed rage, the hidden cruelty, and they often end up expressing that shadow on behalf of the collective. Here's how it works. In any relationship, family, or group, there's a collective shadow, all the qualities the group has agreed to suppress or deny. A family might have a collective shadow of rage that nobody's allowed to express. A workplace might have a collective shadow of ambition and competition that everyone pretends doesn't exist. A spiritual community might have a collective shadow of judgment that contradicts their values of acceptance. Someone has to carry this shadow, and it's usually the most sensitive, empathic person in the system. You absorb all the unexpressed anger, sadness, darkness. It pools in you like toxic waste. And eventually, you express it. You're the one who finally gets angry, the one who finally says what everyone's thinking, the one who breaks down crying or has an outburst or violates the unspoken rules, and the group turns on you. Why are you so angry? Why are you so emotional? Why are you causing problems? But you're not causing the problems. You're expressing the group's shadow that everyone else is suppressing. You're the identified patient, the scapegoat, the one who gets blamed for the dysfunction that actually belongs to everyone. Jung saw this in families constantly. The troubled child who acts out is often just expressing the family's collective shadow. The parents' unacknowledged marital problems, the siblings' hidden resentments, the generational trauma nobody talks about. The child isn't broken. The child is carrying the family's brokenness, and empaths do this in every system they enter. They become the emotional sponge that soaks up everyone's disowned darkness, and when they wring out that sponge, when they finally can't hold it anymore, they're punished for it. You're too negative. You're bringing everyone down. You're the problem. But you're not the problem. You're the symptom of everyone else's unintegrated shadow, and instead of the group doing the work of integration, they cast you out. This is why empaths often feel like they're going crazy. They're holding emotions that don't belong to them, but feel overwhelmingly real. They're angry for no clear reason, except they're carrying someone else's unexpressed rage. They're depressed, except they've absorbed someone else's unacknowledged despair. And nobody validates this experience. Nobody says, "You're carrying our shadow, thank you. Now let us take it back." Instead, they gaslight you. You're too sensitive. You're imagining things. You're the dysfunctional one. Ask yourself, do you often feel emotions that don't seem to match your actual circumstances? Do groups or families tend to make you the scapegoat for larger problems? Do you find yourself expressing feelings that others seem to be suppressing? Do people accuse you of being negative when you're just noticing what's there? If yes, you're carrying the vicarious shadow, and you're being punished for it. Hidden. Reason number 9. The individuation threat. Finally, we come to the deepest reason empaths are hated, one that Jung considered almost spiritual in its implications. When an empath begins to individuate, when they start setting boundaries, prioritizing themselves, refusing to play the helper role, they become a threat to everyone who's been using them. But it's more than just losing access to a resource. Your individuation exposes everyone else's stagnation. When you start saying no, it reveals that others could have been saying no too. When you start prioritizing your needs, it exposes that others have been using selflessness as an excuse for not doing their own work. When you stop absorbing everyone's darkness, it forces them to face their own shadow. Your transformation holds up a mirror to their lack of transformation, and most people respond to this mirror with rage. Jung called this the tall poppy syndrome. In individuation, anyone who rises above the collective consciousness gets cut down by the collective. Because your growth is an implicit judgment on their lack of growth. You're no longer playing by the old rules, no longer participating in the collective agreement to stay small, stay safe, stay asleep. And that makes you dangerous. Families attack members who start therapy because the healing person exposes the family's dysfunction. Friend groups ostracize someone who starts setting boundaries because it reveals everyone else's codependency. Spiritual communities cancel members who start questioning because it threatens the group's comfortable illusions. Your individuation is a threat to everyone's status quo. And rather than being inspired by your transformation, most people will try to drag you back down. They'll guilt trip you. You've changed. You're not the person I knew. You used to be so giving. They'll gaslight you. You're being selfish. You're overreacting. You're making problems where there aren't any. They'll threaten you. If you keep this up, you'll lose everyone. You'll end up alone. And sometimes, often, these threats come true. You do lose people. Your family might reject you. Your friends might abandon you. Your community might cast you out because they need you to stay in your old role. They need you to keep carrying their shadow, keep absorbing their pain, keep giving endlessly while they take. Your individuation disrupts the entire system, and systems defend themselves, often by destroying the element that's threatening the equilibrium. This is the loneliest phase of the empath's journey. When you start waking up, start setting boundaries, start prioritizing yourself, you often have to walk through a period of profound isolation because you're no longer compatible with the people who needed you to stay asleep. But Jung promised this. On the other side of that isolation is genuine community, people who relate to you as a whole person, not as a function. Relationships built on reciprocity instead of extraction. Connections that nourish instead of deplete. But you have to be willing to walk through the fire first. Ask yourself, when you've tried to set boundaries or prioritize yourself, did people accuse you of changing for the worse? Do you feel pressure to stay in your old helper role to maintain relationships? Are you afraid that individuating will mean losing everyone you know? If yes, you're facing the individuation threat. And this is where your real journey begins. These are the 9 hidden reasons empaths become hated. Not all 9 will apply to you, but if you're reading this, at least some of them are operating in your life right now. And until you understand these dynamics, until you can see the invisible forces destroying you, you can't break free. But knowledge isn't enough. Because these patterns don't just cause social problems, they create escalating dangers that can literally destroy your soul. Understanding why empaths are hated is crucial, but it's not enough. Because if you continue operating as an unconscious empath, if you don't integrate Jung's wisdom and transform your pattern, you're facing escalating dangers that go far beyond social rejection. These aren't metaphorical dangers. They're real, documented, life-destroying consequences that Jung observed repeatedly in his practice, and they follow a predictable progression, 5 stages of escalating destruction that end in what Jung called soul death. Let me show you the path you're on if you don't change course. Danger number 1, psychic vampirism. The first danger is that you become an energetic feeding station for people who drain life force. Jung documented what he called psychic parasitism, with individuals who unconsciously or consciously attach to empathic people and extract their energy, vitality, and emotional resources. These aren't necessarily bad people. Most psychic vampires don't even know they're doing it, but they're drawn to empaths like moths to flame because empaths have 3 qualities vampires need. First, porous boundaries that allow easy access to your energy field. Second, a compulsive need to help that prevents you from cutting them off, even when they're clearly draining you. Third, a tendency to take responsibility for others' emotions, which means vampires can offload their pain onto you and walk away feeling lighter while you're left heavy. The mechanism is subtle, but devastating. Every interaction with a psychic vampire leaves you feeling exhausted, depleted, foggy. You might not even notice it at first, just a vague sense that you feel worse after spending time with certain people. But over months and years, it accumulates. You start feeling tired all the time, struggle to get out of bed, lose enthusiasm for things you used to love, feel like you're constantly running on empty. This isn't depression, it's energetic depletion. Jung observed that empaths in this state often develop physical symptoms, chronic fatigue, immune dysfunction, mysterious illnesses that doctors can't diagnose, because you're not just emotionally drained. Your life force itself is being extracted. And here's the cruelest part. The vampires in your life will guilt trip you if you try to set boundaries. I thought you cared about me. I guess I was wrong. You're the only person I can talk to. Please don't abandon me. After everything we've been through together, you're just going to cut me off? They've learned that your empathy is a button they can push to override your boundaries. And if you're an unconscious empath, you'll cave every time. You'll sacrifice your own well-being to avoid the guilt of disappointing someone, to avoid being seen as selfish or cold or uncaring. But Jung warned, this path leads to complete depletion. Eventually, you won't just be tired, you'll be hollow, a shell going through the motions of living while the actual essence of you has been consumed. Warning sign: if you consistently feel exhausted after interactions with certain people, if you struggle to identify where your energy is going, if you feel like you're constantly giving but never receiving, you're being psychically vampirized, and it only gets worse from here. Danger number 2, identity dissolution. The second danger is that you lose your sense of self entirely. Jung called this ego dissolution through empathic absorption, where your identity becomes so enmeshed with others that you no longer know who you are. Here's how it happens. As an empath, you're constantly tuning into others' emotions, needs, desires, pain. You're reading the room, adjusting your behavior, managing everyone's comfort. This requires temporarily suppressing your own emotional reality to make space for theirs. And if you do this chronically, if you spend most of your time merged with others' inner worlds, you lose touch with your own. You literally forget what you want because you're always focused on what others need. You lose access to your authentic preferences because you've trained yourself to defer to others. You can't identify your own emotions because they're drowned out by everyone else's. This is more than just losing yourself in relationships. It's a fundamental dissolution of the ego structure that Jung considered one of the most dangerous psychological states. Because without a coherent sense of self, you become whoever the current situation requires you to be. You're one person with your mother, a different person with your partner, yet another person with your friend. Not in a healthy, adaptive way, but in a fragmented, dissociative way, where none of those versions feel authentic. Jung documented cases where empaths in this state would literally forget their own life story, couldn't remember what they liked or disliked, couldn't make decisions without extensive input from others. They'd become psychological ghosts, present but not real, visible but not substantial. And the terror of this state is profound. Because somewhere, deep inside, you know you're disappearing. You can feel yourself becoming less solid, less defined, less there. But you don't know how to stop it because the only identity you have is helper or caretaker or empath. And those identities only exist in relation to others' needs. If you stop helping, stop caretaking, stop absorbing, then who are you? The question is so threatening that most empaths in this state double down on the pattern instead of facing it. They help more desperately, give more compulsively, trying to solidify an identity through service. But it doesn't work. It just accelerates the dissolution. Warning sign: if you struggle to answer, "What do I want?" without thinking about what others need, if you feel like a different person depending on who you're with, if you experience moments of terrifying disconnection where you can't remember who you actually are, you're experiencing identity dissolution. And the next stage is even darker. Danger number 3, bitter caretaker syndrome. The third danger is the transformation from compassionate helper to resentful martyr. Jung observed this pattern in almost every unconscious helper he worked with, a gradual hardening that occurred over years of unreciprocated giving. It starts with confusion. Why don't people appreciate what I do for them? Then hurt. After everything I've sacrificed, they just take me for granted. Then resentment. Nobody cares about me the way I care about them. Finally, bitter martyrdom. I give and give and give, and everyone just uses me. This is one of the most toxic psychological states Jung identified because it contains a devastating paradox. You keep helping, but you're no longer helping from love. You're helping from resentment, proving your victimhood, collecting evidence of others' ingratitude, building a case for your own martyrdom. The help itself becomes weaponized. Look how much I do for you. Look how I sacrifice. Look how you don't deserve me. Every act of service becomes a stone added to the weight of others' guilt. Every sacrifice becomes an unspoken accusation. And here's the truly destructive part. You start needing people to be ungrateful, because if they were actually appreciative, if relationships became reciprocal, you'd lose your identity as the noble sufferer. Your entire self-concept has become organized around being the unappreciated giver, the one who sacrifices while others take, the martyr whose goodness is too pure for this cruel world. Jung warned that people in this state often unconsciously sabotage healthy relationships because reciprocity threatens their martyrdom narrative. They push away people who actually want to give back because mutual support would dissolve the bitter identity they've constructed. This is soul-corroding work. You become someone you never thought you'd become. Cynical, resentful, keeping score, viewing everyone through a lens of suspicion. What do they want from me? How will they use me? When will they disappoint me? The open heart you once had hardens into armor. The genuine compassion curdles into contempt disguised as concern. And the worst part? You're aware of what's happening but feel powerless to stop it. because stopping would require admitting that your helping has been contaminated all along, that your compassion wasn't as pure as you believed, that you were using others' needs to avoid facing your own, and that admission feels like ego death. So you stay bitter. Keep helping through clenched teeth. Keep collecting grievances until you're so toxic that even the vampires start avoiding you. Warning sign: if you frequently think about how much you give compared to what you receive, if you feel a grim satisfaction when people prove themselves unworthy of your help, if your compassion increasingly feels like obligation rather than choice, you're developing bitter caretaker syndrome. And it only gets darker from here. Danger for 4. Scapegoat crucifixion. The fourth danger is becoming the target of collective shadow projection, where an entire group turns on you and symbolically crucifies you. Jung observed this as an archetypal pattern that repeats across cultures and throughout history, and empaths are particularly vulnerable to it. Here's the mechanism. Every family, workplace, community, or social group has a collective shadow, all the darkness, dysfunction, and unacknowledged toxicity that the group refuses to address. Someone has to carry that shadow, and it's almost always the empath. You've been absorbing everyone's pain, witnessing everyone's secrets, holding space for everyone's dysfunction. You've become the repository for the collective darkness, and eventually the group needs to purge that darkness, but they don't want to face it in themselves, so they project it all onto you and cast you out. This is literal scapegoating, the ancient ritual where a goat was symbolically loaded with the community's sins and driven into the wilderness to die. And when it happens in modern contexts, it's devastating. The entire group suddenly turns on you. People who were once friends become attackers. Your reputation is destroyed. You're accused of things you didn't do, blamed for problems you didn't create. And here's the most confusing part. The accusations often contain a grain of truth, but wildly distorted. Yes, you did express anger, but it was the family's collective rage that you'd been carrying for years. Yes, you did create drama, but only by finally naming the dysfunction everyone had been enabling. Yes, you did violate boundaries, but only because you'd been absorbing everyone's unboundaried pain. The group takes these kernels of truth and inflates them into monstrous accusations. And because you're an empath, you partially believe them. You think, maybe they're right. Maybe I am the problem. Maybe I am toxic. This is the crucifixion, not just the external attack, but the internal collapse where you start believing the projections. Jung documented cases where empaths in this situation experienced complete psychological breakdowns. Some became suicidal, some developed psychosis, some literally died from stress-related illness, because when the entire collective turns on you, when everyone you've sacrificed for joins in condemning you, it activates a primal terror. Humans are tribal creatures. Exile equals death at a deep evolutionary level, and the group knows this. They use your empathy against you, guilting you, shaming you, making you feel like you've committed unforgivable sins. The pain of this betrayal is almost unbearable, because you gave everything to these people. You absorbed their darkness, carried their pain, sacrificed your own well-being for their comfort, and they're destroying you for it. But Jung would say, this is the inevitable result of unconscious helping. When you carry others' shadow without consciousness, without boundaries, without reciprocity, eventually that shadow consumes you, and the group has to destroy you to symbolically destroy their own darkness. It's not personal, it's archetypal, but that doesn't make it hurt less. Warning sign: if you notice a group starting to align against you, if people who were previously supportive suddenly become hostile, if you're being blamed for systemic problems that existed before you, if you feel like you're being set up as a villain, you're being positioned for scapegoat crucifixion, and if you don't extract yourself immediately, You're facing the final danger. Danger after 5, soul death. The fifth and final danger is what Jung called soul death, the complete exhaustion of your life force to the point where you're technically alive but spiritually dead. This is the end stage of unconscious empathic helping. You've been drained by vampires, you've lost your sense of self, you've become bitter and resentful, you've been crucified by the collective, and now you're empty, not sad, not depressed, just gone. Jung described this state as more terrifying than any clinical diagnosis because it exists beyond the reach of conventional therapy. People in soul death wake up every morning and go through the motions. They fulfill their responsibilities, they maintain their routines, they might even still help others mechanically. But there's no one home. The essence, the spark, the vitality, the life force Jung called the self, has been extinguished. They look in the mirror and don't recognize themselves, not because they've changed, but because there's no longer a self doing the looking. It's not suicidal ideation, it's something worse. It's already being dead while the body continues functioning. Jung observed this state in helpers who'd given beyond their capacity for decades, therapists who'd absorbed thousands of patients' traumas without processing their own, caregivers who'd sacrificed everything for others and had nothing left. The symptoms are distinct. Complete emotional numbness. You can't feel joy, sadness, anger, love. Nothing penetrates. Existential exhaustion, not physical tiredness, but a bone-deep depletion of the will to continue. Mechanical functioning. You perform tasks without presence, like a robot executing programmed routines. Inability to imagine a future. Time collapses into an eternal gray present with no hope of change. Disconnection from meaning. Everything that once mattered feels hollow, pointless, absurd. This isn't something medication can fix, isn't something talk therapy can touch. Because the problem isn't neurochemical or cognitive. It's that you've given away your soul in pieces over the years, a bit to this person, a chunk to that relationship, a fragment to this cause, until there's nothing left. You've become a hollow vessel that others pour their pain into, but nothing pours back out because there's no self left to process, integrate, or transform the darkness. Jung considered this the most dangerous outcome of the wounded healer archetype, because people in soul death often don't seek help. They don't think anything's wrong, they just accept this living death as their reality. This is just how life is. This is what it means to be responsible, to be caring, to be an adult. But it's not. It's the final stage of empathic self-destruction. And the tragedy is that it's almost always irreversible by the time it's recognized. Jung said the only way to recover from soul death is a complete ego death and rebirth, a psychological destruction so total that a new self can emerge from the ashes. But most people aren't willing to walk through that fire. The fear of losing what little remains of their identity, even a deadened identity, is too great. So they stay in soul death. Year after year, decade after decade, technically alive but spiritually extinct. Warning sign: if you feel nothing most of the time, if life has become a series of obligations you mechanically fulfill, if you can't remember the last time you felt genuinely alive, if death doesn't scare you because you don't feel alive anyway, you're in or approaching soul death. And this is the point of no return. These 5 dangers represent the escalating path of the unconscious empath. Not everyone progresses through all 5 stages. Some people recognize the pattern and change course. Some die before reaching soul death. Some get stuck at bitter caretaker for decades. But the trajectory is clear. If you continue helping from woundedness, continue absorbing others' shadow without boundaries, continue sacrificing yourself to prove your worth, this is where you're headed. Jung documented this path in countless cases. He saw brilliant, compassionate people destroyed by their own empathy, and he developed a solution, not a simple fix, not a technique or tool, but a complete transformation of the self through what he called individuation, a path that requires you to die to your old identity as helper and be reborn as something Jung called the conscious servant or sovereign healer, someone who can genuinely serve others without being destroyed, who can hold space for darkness without being consumed, who can give freely because they're full, not because they're empty. But this transformation requires brutal honesty, shadow work, and a willingness to lose everything you thought you were. Are you ready for that? Because Jung's solution isn't gentle, it's not comforting. It doesn't tell you you're perfect just as you are. It tells you the hardest truth you'll ever hear. Your empathy is contaminated, your compassion is compromised, and your helping is hurting both you and others. And the only way forward is through complete transformation. After decades of clinical practice, after witnessing countless helpers destroyed by their own compassion, after nearly losing his own mind to the weight of others' darkness, Jung discovered a revolutionary solution. It wasn't what anyone expected. He didn't prescribe better self-care, didn't recommend therapy or medication, didn't suggest gentler boundaries or more balanced giving. Instead, he prescribed something that sounds impossible. Stop helping entirely. Not forever, but long enough to face a question that most empaths spend their entire lives avoiding. Who am I if I'm not the one who helps? This question is the gateway to what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated self, rather than a fragmented collection of roles and reactions. And for empaths, individuation requires something that feels like death. You have to let the helper identity die, because that identity, the one you've built your entire life around, the one that gives you purpose and meaning and worth, is a cage. It's not who you truly are, it's who you learn to be to survive. And until you're willing to release it, you'll never discover your authentic self. Jung's path of transformation has 5 components. Each one is brutally difficult. Each one will make you question everything, but on the other side lies genuine freedom. Component number 1, shadow integration. The first step is confronting the shadow side of your empathy, all the unconscious motives, hidden agendas, and dark truths you don't want to admit. Jung insisted that you cannot help others consciously until you faced your own darkness. And for empaths, that darkness includes some of the most painful admissions. Admission number 1, you help others because you need to be needed. Your entire sense of worth is tied to being useful. If people don't need you, you feel purposeless, worthless, invisible. Your helping isn't primarily about them. It's about you desperately trying to prove you matter. Admission number 2, you use others' problems to avoid your own. It's easier to focus on someone else's crisis than face your own unhealed trauma, your own unmet needs, your own existential emptiness. You've become an expert at everyone else's psychology to avoid looking at your own. Admission number 3, you feel secretly superior when you help. There's a hidden satisfaction in being the capable one, the wise one, the one who has it together enough to rescue others. Your humility is a performance. Underneath it is pride, the ego inflation of identifying with the helper archetype. Admission number 4, you manipulate people through your giving. You give to create obligation, to control how people see you, to ensure they'll stay in your life because they need you. Your compassion has strings attached, contracts you never make explicit but always expect honored. Admission number 5, you resent the people you help. Deep down, you're furious that they take your help without sufficient gratitude, that they don't reciprocate, that they don't see how much you sacrifice. Your victimhood is a weapon you use to guilt others while maintaining your identity as the noble sufferer. These admissions are devastating because they reveal that you're helping the thing you've built your entire identity around, the thing you believe makes you good, is contaminated with ego, need, and manipulation. Jung said you have to sit with this shadow material, journal about it, feel the shame of it, stop defending yourself against it. You have to admit, I haven't been helping from love. I've been helping from wound, from need, from the desperate attempt to prove I'm worthy of existence. This admission feels like dying, because if your helping is corrupt, then who are you? What's left? But Jung promised, this death is necessary. You have to dismantle the false self before the true self can emerge. And the true self isn't the helper. It's something deeper, something that can help or not help with equal authenticity, because its worth isn't dependent on being useful. Practice. Spend 20 minutes journaling on these questions without censoring yourself. What do I secretly get out of helping others? How do I use my giving to control or manipulate? What am I avoiding in my own life by focusing on others' problems? How does my identity depend on being seen as helpful or compassionate? Write until you hit something that makes you want to stop. That's where your shadow lives. Component number 2, boundary sanctification. The second step is establishing what Jung called sacred boundaries, limits that protect your psychic integrity and life force. This is where most empaths fail, because you've been taught that boundaries are selfish, that saying no is cruel, that protecting yourself means abandoning others. But Jung insisted, boundaries aren't walls, they're containers. Without boundaries, you're like a body without skin. Every external force penetrates and infects you. Every request becomes a demand. Every crisis becomes your responsibility. With boundaries, you become a vessel that can hold space for others without being invaded by them. Jung's approach to boundaries was radical for his time and remains radical today. He told his patients, I will see you once a week for 50 minutes. Outside that time, I am not available to you. If you're in crisis, call emergency services. I am not your savior. This wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. He was establishing the container of the therapeutic relationship, defining what he would and wouldn't provide, when and how he was available, what was and wasn't his responsibility. And he expected patients to manage themselves within those boundaries. Most empaths find this approach shocking. But what if they really need me? What if something terrible happens? Jung would say, then they'll find another resource, or they'll discover their own capacity to handle it. Your job isn't to prevent all suffering, it's to witness suffering consciously within appropriate limits. Establishing boundaries requires you to tolerate guilt, because when you say no, when you refuse to be available 24/7, when you stop absorbing everyone's crises, people will be disappointed. Angry, they'll accuse you of being selfish, cold, uncaring, and your wounded helper self will scream, see, you are selfish. You're abandoning people who need you. But Jung would ask, who is being abandoned? Them or the wounded child in you who learned their worth depends on being useful? The guilt you feel when you set boundaries isn't about them. It's about you threatening your own survival mechanism. You learned as a child that being needed equals being safe. Setting boundaries feels like choosing annihilation, but it's not. It's choosing life. Practice. Identify one person in your life who drains you consistently. Write a boundary script. I care about you, but I can't be available for crisis calls anymore. I'm happy to talk during our scheduled times, but outside of that, I need you to manage your emotions independently or reach out to a therapist. You don't have to deliver it yet. Just write it. Feel the terror that arises. Notice the guilt, the shame, the certainty that this makes you a bad person. That's your wounded helper screaming. Let it scream. Don't act on it. Component number 3, discernment practice. The third component is developing what Jung called psychological discernment, the ability to distinguish between genuine calls to service and neurotic compulsion. Not all helping is the same. There's a profound difference between helping someone who genuinely wants to transform versus someone who wants a savior to later crucify, between supporting someone's growth versus enabling their dysfunction, between responding to an authentic need versus responding to your own need to be needed. Jung developed a set of questions he would ask himself before helping anyone. Question number 1. Is this person genuinely asking for help, or am I inserting myself because I can't tolerate their discomfort? Many empaths help people who never asked for help. They see someone struggling and immediately jump in, not because the person wants assistance, but because the empath can't stand witnessing suffering. This isn't helping, it's managing your own anxiety through other people. Question number 2. Is this person willing to do the work, or do they want me to do it for them? Jung distinguished between people genuinely committed to transformation and people seeking magical salvation. If someone wants you to fix them, rescue them, save them while they remain passive, that's not a relationship that serves either of you. Question number 3. Can I help this person without abandoning myself? If helping someone requires you to violate your own boundaries, neglect your own needs, or sacrifice your own well-being, it's not authentic helping. It's self-destruction disguised as compassion. Question number 4. Am I hoping my help will make them love me, need me, validate me? If you're helping to get something back, even something as subtle as feeling worthy or meaningful, the helping is transactional, and transactions always create resentment when the expected payment doesn't arrive. Question number 5. Can I help this person without attachment to the outcome? If you need them to change, heal, or be grateful for your help, to feel okay about yourself, you're not helping them. You're using them to regulate yourself. Jung taught his students to only help when they could honestly answer yes to this question. Would I still offer this help if I knew it would make no difference and they would never thank me? If the answer is no, don't help, because you're not serving them. You're serving your own ego. This level of discernment requires brutal self-honesty. Most of the helping empaths do wouldn't pass these filters, and that's okay. That's the point. You're not supposed to help everyone. You're not supposed to sacrifice yourself constantly. You're supposed to serve when service is genuinely called for and rest when it's not. Practice. Think of someone you're currently helping. Run through Jung's 5 questions honestly. If you can't answer yes to all 5, consider stepping back from that helping relationship. Notice the terror, guilt, and resistance that arises. That's your wounded helper fighting for survival. Component number 4, reciprocity recognition. The 4th component is what Jung called reciprocity recognition, only engaging in relationships where there's mutual exchange of energy. This was revolutionary in Jung's time and remains controversial today because we're taught that real compassion is unconditional, that love means giving without expecting anything in return, that keeping score is petty and unspiritual. But Jung discovered that relationships without reciprocity are psychically destructive, not because you should calculate who owes whom, but because genuine relationship requires mutual vulnerability, mutual support, mutual presence. When the energy only flows one direction, you giving, them taking, it's not relationship, it's extraction, and extraction will kill you. Jung was ruthless about this in his own life. He regularly evaluated his relationships and asked, is this person capable of showing up for me the way I show up for them? If the answer was consistently no, he would decrease his investment in that relationship, not with cruelty, not with punishment, just with clear recognition. This person cannot meet me in mutual relationship, so I will not pretend we have one. This doesn't mean relationships must be perfectly balanced at all times. Sometimes you give more, sometimes they give more. But over time, over the arc of the relationship, there should be genuine reciprocity. They should ask about your life, not just talk about theirs. They should offer support when you're struggling, not just extract support when they are. They should be willing to adjust to your needs sometimes, not expect you to always accommodate theirs. For empaths, this is terrifying, because you've built your entire identity around being the one who gives more, the one who's strong enough not to need, the one who serves without requiring service. Asking for reciprocity feels like admitting weakness, like being needy, like violating your purpose. But Jung would say, that's your wounded helper talking. The true self, the individuated self, knows it's not weakness to need others. It's human. You're allowed to need support. You're allowed to want reciprocity. You're allowed to walk away from relationships where you're consistently the only one giving. In fact, you must, because non-reciprocal relationships are slow suicide. Practice. Make a list of your significant relationships. For each one, honestly assess. Over the past year, has this relationship been reciprocal? Do they show up for me the way I show up for them? If you find yourself making excuses, well, they're going through a hard time, or they're just not as emotionally expressive, or they show love differently. Pay attention. Those might be valid, or they might be justifications for tolerating extraction. Jung would say, trust your gut. If a relationship consistently leaves you depleted, resentful, or feeling unseen, it's not reciprocal, and you need to either renegotiate it or release it. Component number 5, detachment mastery. The fifth and final component is what Jung called detachment mastery, the ability to help without attachment to outcomes or gratitude. This is the highest level of Jung's teaching on helping, and the hardest to achieve, because it requires you to serve from a place of such complete wholeness that you genuinely don't need anything back. Not gratitude, not recognition, not proof that you made a difference. You help because helping is an expression of who you are, not because you're trying to become someone through your helping. Jung described this state as helping from the self rather than helping from the ego. The ego helps to prove its worth, to control outcomes, to create a specific identity. The self helps because service flows naturally from wholeness, like a river flowing to the ocean. It doesn't expect the ocean to thank it, doesn't resent if the water evaporates before reaching the sea, doesn't inflate itself for being a river, it just flows. This is the state Jung achieved after his own individuation crisis, which we'll explore in the next section. After confronting his own shadow, after his near psychotic break, after emerging on the other side, Jung could help others without being destroyed by it, because he'd stopped identifying as helper. He'd stopped needing patients to get better to validate his worth as a therapist. He'd stopped caring whether people were grateful or not. He just showed up, did his work with full presence, and released attachment to what happened next. This level of detachment isn't coldness. It's the deepest form of respect, because it says, you are sovereign over your own life. I can offer guidance, witness your process, hold space for your transformation, but I cannot and will not do the work for you. Your healing is yours. Your life is yours. I am not your savior. This detachment liberates both people. The helper is freed from the burden of saving everyone. The helped is freed from the burden of owing anyone. And paradoxically, this is when genuine transformation becomes possible. Because transformation requires the person to claim their own power. and they can't do that if you're wielding your power over them through compulsive helping. Practice. The next time you help someone, notice your internal landscape. Are you hoping they'll be grateful? Are you checking to see if they're taking your advice? Are you feeling resentful if they don't change? If yes, you're attached to outcomes. Practice this mantra. I offer what I can offer. What they do with it is not my responsibility. Their life is theirs to live. Feel the terror of truly releasing control. Feel the loss of not getting validation from their improvement. That discomfort is the price of genuine service. These 5 components, shadow integration, boundary sanctification, discernment practice, reciprocity recognition, and detachment mastery, form Jung's solution to the empath's paradox. But they're not techniques you apply while remaining fundamentally the same person. They're initiations. Each one requires a death and rebirth. Each one strips away a layer of false identity until you're left with something raw, real, and sovereign. Jung called this process individuation, and he knew from personal experience how brutal it could be, because he'd walked this path himself. Through near madness, through the darkest night of his soul, through complete disintegration of his professional identity and personal reality. Let me show you what Jung's own journey through empathic destruction and rebirth looked like. Because if even the master almost didn't survive it, you need to know what you're facing. To truly understand the difference between unconscious martyrdom and conscious service, we need to look at real lives, historical figures who walked both paths. Jung believed that studying these contrasts was essential because the difference between destruction and transformation often comes down to a single choice. Will you integrate your shadow, or will you be consumed by it? Let me show you 4 lives. 2 who failed to integrate and were destroyed. 2 who succeeded and transformed. Failure case number 1, Vincent van Gogh, the wounded healer who drowned. Vincent van Gogh is remembered as a tortured genius, but Jung would have recognized him as something more specific, an unconscious empath who was devoured by the darkness he absorbed. Vincent's empathy was profound, almost supernatural. He felt the suffering of peasants, prostitutes, miners, the forgotten and discarded. He didn't just see their pain, he merged with it. His paintings weren't observations. They were transmissions, direct channels of emotional reality that flowed through him onto canvas. But Vincent never learned to separate himself from what he was channeling. He would paint desperately, compulsively, trying to process the overwhelming emotional input flooding his system. But it was never enough. The darkness accumulated faster than he could transform it, and he had no boundaries. He gave away his paintings for nothing, supported his brother Theo emotionally while taking from him financially, fell into codependent relationships with damaged women he tried to save, attached himself to other artists who eventually rejected him. Vincent's empathy made him a conduit for collective suffering, but without individuation, without shadow integration, without boundaries, he became a martyr to that suffering. His mental breakdowns weren't random psychosis. They were the result of carrying too much unintegrated shadow material. His system was overloaded with absorbed darkness he couldn't process. The ear-cutting incident Jung would have interpreted as shadow eruption. Vincent's accumulated rage and pain exploding in an act of self-harm because it had nowhere else to go. And Vincent's final years, the increasing paranoia, the sense that others hated him, the feeling of being misunderstood and rejected, these were classic signs of the empath's paradox. He gave everything through his art, his relationships, his life, and he received scorn, poverty, isolation, not because the world was cruel, but because his giving was contaminated with need, desperation, and the unconscious demand that others see his suffering and validate his worth. When they didn't, when his art was rejected, When his relationships failed, when even his beloved brother seemed to tire of supporting him, Vincent had nothing left. He shot himself at 37. Jung would say, Vincent never learned to help others from wholeness. He tried to save the world while drowning himself. He channeled collective darkness without processing his own. He gave from emptiness and was emptied completely. His life is a warning. Unchecked empathy without individuation leads to martyrdom and death. Failure, case number 2, Sylvia Plath, the empath who became the void. Sylvia Plath was another kind of unconscious empath, one who absorbed collective shadow so completely she became indistinguishable from it. Her poetry reveals someone with terrifying, empathic sensitivity. She didn't just feel her own depression, she channeled the feminine shadow of her entire culture. The rage at patriarchy, the suffocation of domesticity, the terror of motherhood, the fury of being reduced to body and function. Sylvia felt it all, and she transmitted it brilliantly through her work. But like Vincent, she had no container for what she was channeling, no boundaries, no way to separate herself from the collective darkness flowing through her. Her journals document a woman trying desperately to be good, perfect, successful, while internally collapsing under the weight of absorbed shadow material. She married Ted Hughes partially because she saw him as a fellow channel for darkness. She thought they could process it together, but instead they amplified each other's wounds. The relationship became a mutual absorption of unintegrated shadow, each triggering the other's deepest pain without the consciousness to transform it. When Ted's infidelity activated Sylvia's abandonment wound, when she was left alone with 2 small children and a mind full of collective rage, she had no resources left. The darkness she'd been channeling her whole life finally consumed her completely. She put her head in an oven at 30. Jung would say, Sylvia mistook absorption for transformation. She thought feeling the collective shadow deeply meant she was processing it, but feeling isn't enough. Without individuation, without separating her identity from the darkness, she became the darkness. Her life shows the danger of empathic sensitivity without sovereignty. She was a pure channel, which meant she had no self left to stand apart from what was flowing through her. Success case number 1. Viktor Frankl, the empath who found meaning. Now contrast those failures with Viktor Frankl, a man who endured the ultimate test of empathic survival. Frankl was a psychiatrist imprisoned in Auschwitz. He lost his wife, his parents, everyone he loved to the Holocaust, and he was surrounded by suffering so immense it would have destroyed most empaths. But Frankl survived, not just physically, psychologically, and he emerged from hell with a therapeutic approach that's helped millions. How, Jung would say, Frankl had unconsciously individuated before the camps. He'd done enough shadow work, established enough boundaries, developed enough sense of self that even genocide couldn't completely dissolve his identity. In the camps, Frankl practiced what Jung would call detachment mastery. He helped fellow prisoners, offered psychological support, shared his meager food, provided meaning in the midst of meaninglessness, but he didn't absorb their suffering in a way that destroyed him. He maintained what Jung called the observing self, a part of consciousness that could witness horror without being consumed by it. Frankl wrote about this explicitly in Man's Search for Meaning. He described being able to step back from his own suffering, to observe it almost clinically, to find meaning even in degradation. This is Jung's conscious compassion in action. Frankl could be present to others' suffering without losing himself in it. He could serve without martyrdom. He could witness darkness without becoming darkness. And after liberation, he didn't collapse into bitterness or trauma, though he certainly carried wounds. Instead, he transformed his experience into logotherapy, a healing modality based on finding meaning in suffering. He helped from wholeness, not from wound, from integrated experience, not from unprocessed pain. Jung would point to Frankl as proof that empaths can survive anything if they've individuated first. The key isn't avoiding darkness. It's building a self strong enough to contain darkness without being consumed by it. Success case number 2, Mother Teresa, the controversial integration. Mother Teresa is a controversial example. Modern critiques have exposed shadow aspects of her work, the valorization of suffering, the inadequate medical care, the missionary agenda. But Jung would say, that's exactly why she's a success case, because Mother Teresa didn't pretend to be a pure angel of compassion. She acknowledged her shadow. Her letters, published posthumously, reveal a woman who spent decades in what she called the dark night of the soul. She felt abandoned by God, doubted her faith, experienced profound spiritual emptiness, and she served anyway. This is what Jung meant by helping from conscious suffering rather than helping from unconscious woundedness. Mother Teresa knew she was broken, knew her faith was failing, knew she was often working from darkness rather than light. But she'd integrated that knowledge. She didn't pretend to be a saint. She didn't inflate herself with the helper archetype. She admitted her shadow, at least to herself and her spiritual directors, and she maintained fierce boundaries that most modern empaths would find shocking. She refused to take on more than her organization could handle. She turned people away when necessary. She insisted on specific rules and structures for her order. She said no constantly. Yes, her work had shadow aspects. All work does. Jung would say, that's not failure, that's honesty. The question isn't, are you perfect? It's, are you conscious of your imperfection? Mother Teresa was, and that consciousness allowed her to serve for decades without burning out, becoming bitter or collapsing into martyrdom. She died at 87, still serving, but from a place of chosen commitment rather than compulsive need. Jung would say, she achieved what most empaths never do, conscious service through integrated shadow. These 4 lives illustrate the fundamental choice every empath faces. Will you be Vincent and Sylvia, brilliant, sensitive, destroyed by the darkness you channel? Or will you be Frankl and Teresa, flawed, conscious, able to serve from wholeness rather than woundedness? The difference isn't intelligence, talent, or even the magnitude of suffering you face. The difference is individuation. Those who integrate their shadow, establish boundaries, and develop a sovereign self can survive anything. Those who don't will be consumed, no matter how pure their intentions or how genuine their gifts. And Jung knew this from the most intimate experience possible, because he almost became Vincent and Sylvia. He almost lost his mind to the darkness he was channeling from his patients. There's a truth they don't teach you in therapy, a truth so devastating it shatters the entire mythology empaths build their lives around. What if the very act of helping others, your greatest gift, your deepest calling, the thing that makes you feel most alive, is precisely what makes people hate you? Not because you're doing it wrong, not because you need better boundaries or clearer communication, but because you're doing it too right. Because your compassion, your genuine care, your willingness to see people in their darkness triggers something in the human psyche so primal, so threatening, that the only defense against it is to destroy the one offering the light. Carl Jung discovered this forbidden pattern buried in the architecture of the unconscious mind. He called it the shadow encounter, and what he found was this: when you truly help someone, when you show up with authentic presence and hold space for their transformation, you're not just offering support, you're holding up a mirror, and that mirror reflects everything they refuse to see about themselves, every unlived potential, every avoided responsibility, every choice they're making to stay small and safe and suffering. Your very existence becomes an accusation they never asked to hear. Your light exposes their darkness, and darkness, when confronted, doesn't thank you. It tries to extinguish the light. This is the cosmic joke that empaths spend decades trying to solve. You believe you're hated because you're not helpful enough, so you help harder, sacrifice more, give until you're empty. And the hatred only intensifies, because the problem was never your technique. The problem is that genuine help is a form of violence to the unconscious mind. It disrupts the comfortable lie. It threatens the identity built on victimhood. It demands transformation in a world addicted to stagnation. As Jung wrote, the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But here's what Jung observed that few dare to speak aloud. Most people violently resist transformation. They'd rather hate you than change. You're not hated despite your helping. You're hated because of it. Let me paint you a picture of suffering you know intimately. You're the one everyone calls at midnight when their world is falling apart. You're the friend who drops everything, who listens for hours, who holds the space for pain so raw it would break most people. You're the one who shows up to every crisis, every emergency, every dark night of the soul. You give from a place so genuine it hurts. You sacrifice your own needs, your own time, your own healing, because someone else is drowning and you can't walk away from drowning people. And somehow, impossibly, you become the villain. You're called manipulative when you're being authentic, controlling when you're expressing concern, dramatic when you're honest about your own pain, toxic when you finally, after years of depletion, set your first boundary. The person you talked off the ledge ghosts you. The friend whose relationship you helped them escape blames you for their loneliness. The family member you sacrificed everything for tells others you're the problem. The partner whose trauma you absorbed for years leaves you for being too much. This is the empath's devastating confusion. Why does trying to help people make them hate me? And the false belief you've internalized, the lie that's poisoning you from the inside. I must be doing something wrong. I must be secretly bad. There must be something fundamentally broken in me that turns love into resentment, service into suspicion, compassion into contempt. But what if the hatred isn't evidence of your failure? What if it's evidence of your success? Jung spent his life mapping the hidden architecture of the human psyche, and what he discovered changes everything about how we understand the helper-hatred dynamic. He called it projection. He called it the shadow. And the mechanism works like this. When an empath offers genuine help, they're not just providing practical support or emotional presence. They're unconsciously activating a mirror function in the other person's psyche. That mirror reflects back what the person is not doing for themselves, what they're not willing to feel, what they're refusing to become. Your compassion reveals their callousness. Your responsibility highlights their avoidance. Your emotional availability contrasts their numbness. Your willingness to face pain exposes their addiction to denial. You become a walking judgment without ever opening your mouth. You become a living confrontation with their unlived life. Jung discovered something that the helping professions desperately hide. Most people are deeply invested in their suffering because their suffering has become their identity. It's not just that they're stuck in pain. They've built an entire psychological structure around their wounds. Their victim story gives them moral high ground. Their helplessness exempts them from responsibility. Their suffering becomes their currency for attention, their shield against expectation, their proof that they're special in their pain. When an empath arrives offering genuine transformation, they threaten this entire system. They're not just offering a way out. They're dismantling the architecture of victimhood that the person has spent years constructing. The helped person must now choose, transform, and face the terror of their own capacity, or destroy the helper and preserve the comfortable identity of powerlessness. The hatred is the choice to preserve the prison. Jung used the metaphor of psychological equilibrium to explain this. Every human being creates a homeostatic system around their wounds, a careful balance of defenses, narratives, and behaviors that keep them in the familiar territory of their suffering. This equilibrium might be painful, but it's known, it's safe. An empath who disrupts this equilibrium, even with love, even with the purest intention, becomes the enemy because they're destabilizing the known self. It's not personal, it's archetypal. You're encountering what Jung called resistance to individuation, the psyche's violent rejection of its own evolution. Here's the hidden transaction that empaths miss. When someone asks for help, they're often asking for validation of their helplessness, not actual transformation. They want you to witness their suffering and confirm that, yes, this is too hard. Yes, you're right to stay stuck. Yes, the world is against you and there's nothing you can do. They want enabling disguised as empathy. The empath mistake is giving transformation when the person wanted a witness to their victimhood. This creates cognitive dissonance so intense that the only way to resolve it is to make the helper the problem. As Jung wrote, there is no coming to consciousness without pain. You, the empath, are the pain they're trying to avoid. Your very presence is the suffering that consciousness demands, and so you must be eliminated. Let me tell you about Elena, 29 years old, intuitive beyond measure, the kind of person who could feel the emotional weather in a room before she even walked through the door. For 5 years, she was the unofficial therapist in her friend group, the one everyone called during breakups, job losses, family implosions, existential crises at 3 a.m. She'd drop everything. She'd listen with a depth of presence most therapists never achieve. She'd offer insights that cut through years of confusion and helped people see their patterns with crystalline clarity. There was Rachel, stuck in a relationship so toxic it was slowly erasing her. Elena spent hours, dozens of midnight conversations, helping Rachel see the manipulation, the gaslighting, the way her partner weaponized her empathy against her. Rachel left him, thanked Elena with tears in her eyes, said she'd saved her life. 3 weeks later, Rachel was back with the same partner, and suddenly, Elena was the problem. Rachel stopped returning her calls. When Elena asked what changed, Rachel said she was tired of Elena's judgment, tired of her thinking she knew what was best for everyone. There was Marcus, brilliant but self-sabotaging, who couldn't keep a job because he'd unconsciously destroy every opportunity right before success. Elena helped him see the pattern, the childhood wound driving it, the fear of being seen, the safety of failure. Marcus implemented her suggestions, got promoted, started thriving. 6 months later, Elena heard through mutual friends that Marcus had been telling people Elena takes credit for other people's growth and that she had savior complex issues. The breaking point came with an intervention Elena organized for a friend spiraling into addiction. She coordinated everything, held the space, absorbed the rage, stayed present through the chaos. The friend got sober, rebuilt their life. It was a genuine miracle. But 6 months later, when Elena was drowning in her own crisis, her mother had just died, and she was fracturing under grief, the entire friend group vanished. When she reached out, confused and desperate, she was told she was creating drama and needed to work on herself. The devastating realization that broke Elena open. She'd been useful, not valued. The moment she needed reciprocity, the moment she stopped functioning as their emotional utility service, she became disposable. She wasn't hated for helping badly. She was hated for helping so well that people felt indebted, exposed, and diminished. Her competence reminded them of their incompetence. Her consciousness confronted their unconsciousness. Her very existence became an accusation they couldn't forgive. Jung had a concept for this: the helpful introject, the helper who gets internalized as a critical voice, a conscience that won't be silenced. Elena had become their internal judge, and the only way to silence that judgment was to exile her from their lives completely. Let me give you the framework Jung never wrote explicitly, but that lives in the shadows of his entire body of work: the 9 hidden reasons empaths get hated for helping. These aren't surface explanations. These are the unconscious mechanisms operating beneath every helping interaction that ends in betrayal. Reason 1. You expose their shadow by embodying its opposite. Your compassion reveals their callousness. Your responsibility highlights their avoidance. Your emotional availability contrasts their numbness. You don't have to say a word. Your existence is the judgment. You become a walking mirror reflecting everything they're not willing to be. And people don't hate mirrors because mirrors lie. They hate mirrors because mirrors tell the truth. Reason 2. You disrupt the comfortable lie. Most people narrate their lives as victims of circumstance. It's the most seductive story humans tell. I'm suffering because of forces beyond my control. Your help proves circumstances can be changed, which means they're choosing their suffering. This revelation is intolerable. It strips them of the one thing protecting them from self-responsibility. They must discredit you to maintain the story that absolves them of agency. You're not hated for helping. You're hated for proving that change is possible, which makes their continued suffering look like choice. Reason 3. You create debt without demanding payment. Jung identified what he called the debt complex: unconscious guilt from unpaid obligations. When empaths help without keeping score, without expecting reciprocity, they create massive psychological debt in others. And here's the dark truth about human psychology: people resent what they owe, especially when they know deep down they'll never repay it. The only way to eliminate debt without paying it back is to devalue the creditor, so they make you the problem. Your generosity becomes manipulation in the story they tell themselves. Your selflessness becomes proof that you must have some hidden agenda, because if you're just genuinely good, then their inability to reciprocate makes them bad, and no one wants to be bad, so you must become bad instead. Reason 4. You witness their lowest moment. People reveal vulnerability in crisis. They show you the raw, undefended parts of themselves they spend their entire lives hiding. And then, when the crisis passes and they return to their defended normal, you become a living reminder of their breakdown. The intimacy you shared during their dark night becomes unbearable in their daylight. You know too much. You saw too much. The exile is an erasure of the shameful self you witnessed. Your presence triggers the memory of their weakness, and they can't forgive you for being there when they fell apart. Reason 5. Your growth exposes their stagnation. If you remain stuck, they can justify their stuckness. But when you, who also suffered, who also struggled, who also started broken, heal and evolve, you become living proof that transformation is possible. This makes their continued suffering look like choice instead of fate. Rather than face that unbearable truth, they pathologize your growth. You've changed, they say, and it's always an accusation, never a celebration, because your change proves their choice to stay the same. Reason 6. You refuse to enable their unconscious patterns. Real help disrupts patterns. Enabling reinforces them. When you offer genuine help that requires their participation in change, you're asking them to give up the secondary gains of victimhood, the attention, the exemption from responsibility, the moral superiority that comes from suffering nobly. They didn't want transformation. They wanted rescue. They wanted you to fix their problems while they remained exactly who they are. You're hated for giving medicine instead of candy. Reason 7. You make them feel their own capacity, and they hate it. Your belief in them confronts their belief in their own helplessness. This is existentially terrifying. Helplessness is safe. No one expects anything from you. No one holds you accountable. You get to be small and protected and pitied. Your help says, you're capable. And that means they can no longer hide behind, I can't. The hatred is resistance to their own power, projected onto the person who dared to see it. Reason 8. You practice boundaries, which feels like rejection. Eventually, empaths learn to say no. They learn to protect their energy. They learn that helping someone who doesn't want to change is like pouring water into a bucket with no bottom. And people who benefited from your boundarylessness experience healthy boundaries as betrayal. You've changed means you're no longer exploitable. The hatred is grief over losing their emotional utility service, disguised as moral judgment of your newfound selfishness. Reason 9. You're living proof that consciousness is possible. This is Jung's ultimate insight. Unconscious people are threatened by conscious ones. Your self-awareness, emotional regulation, and authentic living expose how much everyone else is performing, numbing, and hiding. You're a walking challenge to the collective agreement to remain asleep. The hatred is existential. You represent the road not taken, the potential unlived, the consciousness they're terrified to claim. You make them feel the weight of their own unconsciousness, and nothing is more unbearable than that. Take a moment. Which reason hit hardest? Comment the number below. Your answer reveals which shadow dynamic you encounter most often in your relationships. But before we move forward, I need to say something that might be uncomfortable, because Jung's work demands brutal honesty, even when that honesty implicates ourselves. Sometimes the hatred is warranted. Sometimes what empaths call helping is actually unconscious control. Sometimes our gift for service becomes a weapon of manipulation we don't even know we're wielding. The empath has a shadow too, and that shadow includes hidden superiority, the subtle belief that you're more evolved than these unconscious people stumbling through life. It includes savior complex, the addiction to being the only one who can fix things. It includes boundary violation, giving unasked for advice because you're so certain you know what's best. It includes covert contracts, helping so that people will finally love you the way you need to be loved. It includes martyrdom addiction, the unconscious attachment to suffering because your suffering proves your virtue. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Even helpers have shadows, especially helpers, because the helper role is the perfect disguise for our own unhealed wounds. We can avoid facing our own emptiness by constantly filling others. We can avoid our own pain by constantly treating others. We can avoid our own need to be helped by positioning ourselves as the one who helps. So examine your motivations with ruthless honesty. Are you helping because it genuinely serves, or because being needed validates your existence? Are you respecting others' autonomy, or are you subtly controlling outcomes to match your vision of their healing? Are you allowing people their own journey, even when that journey includes failure and pain, or are you imposing your rescue mission on their story? This video is not permission to dismiss all criticism as projection. Some feedback is valid. Real shadow work means holding two truths simultaneously. 1, you're often hated for genuinely good helping. And 2, some of your helping might be unconscious manipulation disguised as compassion. The ability to distinguish requires the most difficult practice in Jung's entire body of work: radical self-honesty. So how do you break free? How do you evolve from wounded helper to sovereign healer? Jung's process of individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, offers a roadmap specifically for empaths trapped in the helper-hatred cycle. It happens in 4 stages. Stage 1 is unconscious martyrdom. You're completely identified with the helper role. Your entire sense of worth comes from being needed. You genuinely don't know who you'd be if you weren't helping. Every relationship is organized around your usefulness. You're exhausted, resentful, and desperately confused why helping doesn't create the love you need. This is what Jung called persona possession. The mask has become the face. You're not being helpful. You are the helper. And beneath that identity is terror. Terror that without the helper mask, there's nothing underneath. Stage 2 is the betrayal awakening. Something breaks you open, usually a massive betrayal, by someone you helped profoundly. The person you gave everything to discards you, blames you, villainizes you, and suddenly the scales fall from your eyes. You see the patterns. You've been used repeatedly. The people you helped most love you least. Your gift has been exploited. This stage is rage and grief and complete disorientation. Many empaths get stuck here, swinging wildly from overhelping to refusing all connection. Jung called this an antiodromia, the violent swing to the opposite pole. You go from boundaryless to walled off, from martyr to misanthrope. Stage 3 is withdrawal and discernment. You pull back dramatically. You stop helping, stop responding to every crisis, stop making yourself available for emotional labor. This feels selfish and wrong. Your entire identity rebels. But it's necessary. In this hermit phase, you're learning discernment. Who actually wants transformation? Who just wants enabling? Whose journey is theirs to walk alone? You're practicing what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the excruciating discomfort of not rescuing while still staying compassionate. You discover you can care without carrying. You develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to help without losing yourself in the helping. Stage 4 is conscious service. You emerge transformed. You help from overflow, not depletion. You offer assistance without attachment to outcome. You can recognize when help will be hated and choose whether to offer it anyway. You understand that hatred often means you're doing good work, but you're no longer destroyed by it. You've integrated the shadow. You can be selfish and generous, boundaried and compassionate. You help those who truly want transformation, not those who want validation of victimhood. You've become what Jung called the wounded healer, one who serves from integrated wholeness, not unhealed woundedness. Which stage are you in right now? And what's one thing keeping you from the next stage? Let me give you a practical tool for discernment, a framework rooted in Jung's method of active imagination. Before you help anyone, pause and ask yourself these 9 questions. Did they ask, or did I offer unsolicited help? Because unsolicited help is often projection of your own unlived needs onto their situation. Am I helping them do something they can't do or something they won't do? Can't is genuine help. Won't is enabling. Does my help increase their capacity or increase their dependency? Empowerment versus disempowerment. Am I comfortable with them saying no to my help? If not, it's control disguised as service. Do I feel resentful if they don't follow my advice or appreciate my effort? Resentment reveals covert contracts. Would I still help if no one ever knew? This tests for ego need versus genuine care. Am I helping to avoid facing my own problems? Are you fixing in them what's broken in you? Does helping them deplete me or does it flow naturally? Depletion suggests compulsion. Flow suggests alignment. Can I allow them to fail and suffer natural consequences? True help includes letting people learn through pain. Before you help, check your body, feel into your motivation. If there's urgency, desperation, or neediness, that's your wound, not their need. If there's spaciousness, clarity, and freedom to help or not help, that's conscious service. Jung's active imagination technique can be powerful here. Have a dialogue with your inner helper. Ask it directly. Why do you need to help this person? What do you get from it? What are you avoiding by focusing on their problems? Listen for the truth beneath the righteous helping story. The goal isn't to stop helping, it's to help consciously, from wholeness instead of woundedness. Let me tell you about Marcus, because Elena's story isn't the only one that matters. Marcus was 35 when his body forced him to face what his mind refused to see. He'd built his entire identity on being the rock everyone leaned on. His father was an alcoholic, his mother depressed. And from age 8, Marcus learned that his value came from being helpful, strong, and never needing anything. By adulthood, he was the friend everyone called in crisis, the co-worker who stayed late helping others meet deadlines while his own projects suffered, the partner who absorbed his girlfriend's trauma while hiding his own beneath a performance of strength. He was chronically exhausted, medicated for anxiety, and desperately lonely despite being surrounded by people who needed him. His awakening came through collapse, a health crisis. His body literally gave out under the weight of all that unprocessed emotion, forced months of unavailability. And during recovery, something stunning happened. Most people disappeared. The ones who remained were few, but they were the ones who'd always offered reciprocity. He realized he'd built a life around useful relationships, not real ones. His transformation began with saying no. At first, it felt like death. His entire self-concept crumbled. Who was he if not helpful? The discomfort was excruciating, but slowly he discovered himself beneath the helper mask. Someone who loved music, who needed solitude, who had his own dreams that had been sacrificed to everyone else's needs. The pivotal moment came when a former friend called demanding help with a crisis. Marcus felt the old compulsion rising like a tidal wave, but this time he paused. He checked in with himself. Would helping this person who's never reciprocated deplete me? Yes, he said no. The friend called him selfish, accused him of changing for the worse. And instead of collapsing in shame like he'd done 1,000 times before, Marcus felt something he'd never experienced: freedom. He'd prioritized himself and survived. The hatred didn't kill him. He'd become sovereign. Here's a truth that will flip everything. The people who hate you for helping are showing you your own shadow. Every accusation contains a kernel of truth about your unconscious patterns. This is the mirror working in reverse. When someone calls you controlling, ask, am I trying to control outcomes? When they say you're dramatic, ask, am I amplifying emotions for impact? When they claim you're judgmental, ask, am I secretly feeling superior? When they accuse you of creating dependency, ask, do I need to be needed? This isn't about taking on false blame. This is about mining every interaction for self-knowledge. Jung believed our enemies are our greatest teachers because they mirror what we can't see in ourselves. The hatred stops destroying you when you use it as feedback for shadow integration rather than evidence of your unworthiness. You're hated for genuinely good helping, and you have unconscious shadows in your helping. Both are true. This is Jung's transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites without collapsing into either extreme. Some hatred is projection, some is accurate. Discernment is knowing which is which. As Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. I need to tell you something personal, because I'd be a hypocrite if I taught this from a place of superiority. I spent years helping people because I was terrified to help myself. I was fixing others because I felt broken and didn't know how to fix me. I was over-functioning in everyone else's life because my own life felt meaningless without the validation that came from being needed. The hardest moment of my life was realizing I was addicted to being needed, that my gift for helping was actually a trauma response to never having been helped myself. that I was using service as a drug to numb my own pain. The hatred I received wasn't just about them. It was the universe forcing me to face the truth that I was giving to get, helping to be loved, serving to matter. I'm not teaching you from some enlightened mountaintop. I'm teaching you from the trenches of this exact pattern. I know the agony of being hated for genuinely caring, and I know the humbling recognition that some of my caring was unconscious need, disguised as generosity. This work isn't about perfection, it's about consciousness. It's about being willing to see yourself fully, even when what you see isn't pretty. Imagine a world where empaths evolve from wounded helpers to sovereign healers, where helping is conscious, boundaried, and reciprocal instead of compulsive, depleting, and one-directional. Jung believed humanity is undergoing collective individuation, a species-wide awakening from unconscious patterns. Empaths who break the helper-hatred cycle are contributing to this evolution. You're not just healing yourself, you're creating a template in the collective unconscious that makes it easier for the next empath to break free. The vision is this: communities where everyone is both helped and helper, where vulnerability is met with respect, not exploitation, where consciousness is valued, not punished. This begins with individual empaths refusing to betray themselves in the name of helping others. Your liberation is evolutionary work. So who do you become when you release the helper identity? Not what you do, but who you are. You're not hated because you're doing helping wrong. You're hated because you're doing consciousness right. Every time someone vilifies you for genuine compassion, they're revealing their own terror of transformation. That's not about you. That's about them encountering their unlived potential in your presence. You're not here to make everyone comfortable. You're not here to earn love through service. You're not here to prove your worth by fixing what's broken. You're here to help those who truly want transformation, release those who want enabling, and honor yourself enough to know the difference. The hatred stops mattering when you stop believing you're supposed to be universally loved. You're not. Conscious people rarely are. You're here to serve truth, not ego, to empower growth, not enable stagnation, to be sovereign, not safe. That's not helping. That's healing. That's not being an empath. That's being whole. Elena takes credit for other people's growth and that she had savior complex issues. The breaking point came with an intervention Elena organized for a friend spiraling into addiction. She coordinated everything, held the space, absorbed the rage, stayed present through the chaos. The friend got sober, rebuilt their life. It was a genuine miracle. But 6 months later, when Elena was drowning in her own crisis, her mother had just died, and she was fracturing under grief, the entire friend group vanished. When she reached out, confused and desperate, she was told she was creating drama and needed to work on herself. The devastating realization that broke Elena open. She'd been useful, not valued. The moment she needed reciprocity, the moment she stopped functioning as their emotional utility service, she became disposable. She wasn't hated for helping badly. She was hated for helping so well that people felt indebted, exposed, and diminished. Her competence reminded them of their incompetence. Her consciousness confronted their unconsciousness. Her very existence became an accusation they couldn't forgive. Jung had a concept for this: the helpful introject, the helper who gets internalized as a critical voice, a conscience that won't be silenced. Elena had become their internal judge, and the only way to silence that judgment was to exile her from their lives completely. Let me give you the framework Jung never wrote explicitly, but that lives in the shadows of his entire body of work: the 9 hidden reasons empaths get hated for helping. These aren't surface explanations. These are the unconscious mechanisms operating beneath every helping interaction that ends in betrayal. Reason 1. You expose their shadow by embodying its opposite. Your compassion reveals their callousness. Your responsibility highlights their avoidance. Your emotional availability contrasts their numbness. You don't have to say a word. Your existence is the judgment. You become a walking mirror reflecting everything they're not willing to be. And people don't hate mirrors because mirrors lie. They hate mirrors because mirrors tell the truth. Reason 2. You disrupt the comfortable lie. Most people narrate their lives as victims of circumstance. It's the most seductive story humans tell. I'm suffering because of forces beyond my control. Your help proves circumstances can be changed, which means they're choosing their suffering. This revelation is intolerable. It strips them of the one thing protecting them from self-responsibility. They must discredit you to maintain the story that absolves them of agency. You're not hated for helping. You're hated for proving that change is possible, which makes their continued suffering look like choice. Reason 3. You create debt without demanding payment. Jung identified what he called the debt complex, unconscious guilt from unpaid obligations. When empaths help without keeping score, without expecting reciprocity, they create massive psychological debt in others. And here's the dark truth about human psychology. People resent what they owe, especially when they know deep down they'll never repay it. The only way to eliminate debt without paying it back is to devalue the creditor, so they make you the problem. Your generosity becomes manipulation in the story they tell themselves. Your selflessness becomes proof that you must have some hidden agenda, because if you're just genuinely good, then their inability to reciprocate makes them bad, and no one wants to be bad, so you must become bad instead. Reason 4. You witness their lowest moment. People reveal vulnerability in crisis. They show you the raw, undefended parts of themselves they spend their entire lives hiding. And then, when the crisis passes and they return to their defended normal, you become a living reminder of their breakdown. The intimacy you shared during their dark night becomes unbearable in their daylight. You know too much. You saw too much. The exile is an erasure of the shameful self you witnessed. Your presence triggers the memory of their weakness, and they can't forgive you for being there when they fell apart. Reason 5. Your growth exposes their stagnation. If you remain stuck, they can justify their stuckness. But when you, who also suffered, who also struggled, who also started broken, heal and evolve, you become living proof that transformation is possible. This makes their continued suffering look like choice instead of fate. Rather than face that unbearable truth, they pathologize your growth. You've changed, they say, and it's always an accusation, never a celebration, because your change proves their choice to stay the same. Reason 6. You refuse to enable their unconscious patterns. Real help disrupts patterns. Enabling reinforces them. When you offer genuine help that requires their participation in change, you're asking them to give up the secondary gains of victimhood, the attention, the exemption from responsibility, the moral superiority that comes from suffering nobly. They didn't want transformation. They wanted rescue. They wanted you to fix their problems while they remained exactly who they are. You're hated for giving medicine instead of candy. Reason 7. You make them feel their own capacity, and they hate it. Your belief in them confronts their belief in their own helplessness. This is existentially terrifying. Helplessness is safe. No one expects anything from you. No one holds you accountable. You get to be small and protected and pitied. Your help says, you're capable. And that means they can no longer hide behind, I can't. The hatred is resistance to their own power, projected onto the person who dared to see it. Reason 8. You practice boundaries, which feels like rejection. Eventually, empaths learn to say no. They learn to protect their energy. They learn that helping someone who doesn't want to change is like pouring water into a bucket with no bottom. And people who benefited from your boundarylessness experience healthy boundaries as betrayal. You've changed means you're no longer exploitable. The hatred is grief over losing their emotional utility service, disguised as moral judgment of your newfound selfishness. Reason 9. You're living proof that consciousness is possible. This is Jung's ultimate insight. Unconscious people are threatened by conscious ones. Your self-awareness, emotional regulation, and authentic living expose how much everyone else is performing, numbing, and hiding. You're a walking challenge to the collective agreement to remain asleep. The hatred is existential. You represent the road not taken, the potential unlived, the consciousness they're terrified to claim. You make them feel the weight of their own unconsciousness, and nothing is more unbearable than that. Take a moment. Which reason hit hardest? Comment the number below. Your answer reveals which shadow dynamic you encounter most often in your relationships. But before we move forward, I need to say something that might be uncomfortable, because Jung's work demands brutal honesty, even when that honesty implicates ourselves. Sometimes the hatred is warranted. Sometimes what empaths call helping is actually unconscious control. Sometimes our gift for service becomes a weapon of manipulation we don't even know we're wielding. The empath has a shadow too, and that shadow includes hidden superiority, the subtle belief that you're more evolved than these unconscious people stumbling through life. It includes savior complex, the addiction to being the only one who can fix things. It includes boundary violation, giving unasked for advice because you're so certain you know what's best. It includes covert contracts, helping so that people will finally love you the way you need to be loved. It includes martyrdom addiction, the unconscious attachment to suffering because your suffering proves your virtue. Jung wrote, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is." Even helpers have shadows, especially helpers, because the helper role is the perfect disguise for our own unhealed wounds. We can avoid facing our own emptiness by constantly filling others. We can avoid our own pain by constantly treating others. We can avoid our own need to be helped by positioning ourselves as the one who helps. So examine your motivations with ruthless honesty. Are you helping because it genuinely serves, or because being needed validates your existence? Are you respecting others' autonomy, or are you subtly controlling outcomes to match your vision of their healing? Are you allowing people their own journey, even when that journey includes failure and pain, or are you imposing your rescue mission on their story? This video is not permission to dismiss all criticism as projection. Some feedback is valid. Real shadow work means holding two truths simultaneously. 1, you're often hated for genuinely good helping. And 2, some of your helping might be unconscious manipulation disguised as compassion. The ability to distinguish requires the most difficult practice in Jung's entire body of work: radical self-honesty. So how do you break free? How do you evolve from wounded helper to sovereign healer? Jung's process of individuation, the journey of becoming who you truly are, offers a roadmap specifically for empaths trapped in the helper-hatred cycle. It happens in 4 stages. Stage 1 is unconscious martyrdom. You're completely identified with the helper role. Your entire sense of worth comes from being needed. You genuinely don't know who you'd be if you weren't helping. Every relationship is organized around your usefulness. You're exhausted, resentful, and desperately confused why helping doesn't create the love you need. This is what Jung called persona possession. The mask has become the face. You're not being helpful. You are the helper. And beneath that identity is terror. Terror that without the helper mask, there's nothing underneath. Stage 2 is the betrayal awakening. Something breaks you open, usually a massive betrayal. by someone you helped profoundly. The person you gave everything to discards you, blames you, villainizes you, and suddenly the scales fall from your eyes. You see the patterns. You've been used repeatedly. The people you helped most love you least. Your gift has been exploited. This stage is rage and grief and complete disorientation. Many empaths get stuck here, swinging wildly from overhelping to refusing all connection. Jung called this an antiodromia, the violent swing to the opposite pole. You go from boundaryless to walled off, from martyr to misanthrope. Stage 3 is withdrawal and discernment. You pull back dramatically. You stop helping, stop responding to every crisis, stop making yourself available for emotional labor. This feels selfish and wrong. Your entire identity rebels. But it's necessary. In this hermit phase, you're learning discernment. Who actually wants transformation? Who just wants enabling? Whose journey is theirs to walk alone? You're practicing what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, the excruciating discomfort of not rescuing while still staying compassionate. You discover you can care without carrying. You develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to help without losing yourself in the helping. Stage 4 is conscious service. You emerge transformed. You help from overflow, not depletion. You offer assistance without attachment to outcome. You can recognize when help will be hated and choose whether to offer it anyway. You understand that hatred often means you're doing good work, but you're no longer destroyed by it. You've integrated the shadow. You can be selfish and generous, boundaried and compassionate. You help those who truly want transformation, not those who want validation of victimhood. You've become what Jung called the wounded healer, one who serves from integrated wholeness, not unhealed woundedness. Which stage are you in right now? And what's one thing keeping you from the next stage? Let me give you a practical tool for discernment, a framework rooted in Jung's method of active imagination. Before you help anyone, pause and ask yourself these 9 questions. Did they ask, or did I offer unsolicited help? Because unsolicited help is often projection of your own unlived needs onto their situation. Am I helping them do something they can't do or something they won't do? Can't is genuine help. Won't is enabling. Does my help increase their capacity or increase their dependency? Empowerment versus disempowerment. Am I comfortable with them saying no to my help? If not, it's control disguised as service. Do I feel resentful if they don't follow my advice or appreciate my effort? Resentment reveals covert contracts. Would I still help if no one ever knew? This tests for ego need versus genuine care. Am I helping to avoid facing my own problems? Are you fixing in them what's broken in you? Does helping them deplete me or does it flow naturally? Depletion suggests compulsion. Flow suggests alignment. Can I allow them to fail and suffer natural consequences? True help includes letting people learn through pain. Before you help, check your body, feel into your motivation. If there's urgency, desperation, or neediness, that's your wound, not their need. If there's spaciousness, clarity, and freedom to help or not help, that's conscious service. Jung's active imagination technique can be powerful here. Have a dialogue with your inner helper. Ask it directly. Why do you need to help this person? What do you get from it? What are you avoiding by focusing on their problems? Listen for the truth beneath the righteous helping story. The goal isn't to stop helping, it's to help consciously, from wholeness instead of woundedness. Let me tell you about Marcus, because Elena's story isn't the only one that matters. Marcus was 35 when his body forced him to face what his mind refused to see. He'd built his entire identity on being the rock everyone leaned on. His father was an alcoholic, his mother depressed. And from age 8, Marcus learned that his value came from being helpful, strong, and never needing anything. By adulthood, he was the friend everyone called in crisis, the co-worker who stayed late helping others meet deadlines while his own projects suffered, the partner who absorbed his girlfriend's trauma while hiding his own beneath a performance of strength. He was chronically exhausted, medicated for anxiety, and desperately lonely despite being surrounded by people who needed him. His awakening came through collapse, a health crisis. His body literally gave out under the weight of all that unprocessed emotion, forced months of unavailability. And during recovery, something stunning happened. Most people disappeared. The ones who remained were few, but they were the ones who'd always offered reciprocity. He realized he'd built a life around useful relationships, not real ones. His transformation began with saying no. At first, it felt like death. His entire self-concept crumbled. Who was he if not helpful? The discomfort was excruciating, but slowly he discovered himself beneath the helper mask. Someone who loved music, who needed solitude, who had his own dreams that had been sacrificed to everyone else's needs. The pivotal moment came when a former friend called demanding help with a crisis. Marcus felt the old compulsion rising like a tidal wave, but this time he paused. He checked in with himself. Would helping this person who's never reciprocated deplete me? Yes, he said no. The friend called him selfish, accused him of changing for the worse. And instead of collapsing in shame like he'd done 1,000 times before, Marcus felt something he'd never experienced: freedom. He'd prioritized himself and survived. The hatred didn't kill him. He'd become sovereign. Here's a truth that will flip everything. The people who hate you for helping are showing you your own shadow. Every accusation contains a kernel of truth about your unconscious patterns. This is the mirror working in reverse. When someone calls you controlling, ask, am I trying to control outcomes? When they say you're dramatic, ask, am I amplifying emotions for impact? When they claim you're judgmental, ask, am I secretly feeling superior? When they accuse you of creating dependency, ask, do I need to be needed? This isn't about taking on false blame. This is about mining every interaction for self-knowledge. Jung believed our enemies are our greatest teachers because they mirror what we can't see in ourselves. The hatred stops destroying you when you use it as feedback for shadow integration rather than evidence of your unworthiness. You're hated for genuinely good helping, and you have unconscious shadows in your helping. Both are true. This is Jung's transcendent function, the ability to hold opposites without collapsing into either extreme. Some hatred is projection, some is accurate. Discernment is knowing which is which. As Jung wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. I need to tell you something personal, because I'd be a hypocrite if I taught this from a place of superiority. I spent years helping people because I was terrified to help myself. I was fixing others because I felt broken and didn't know how to fix me. I was over-functioning in everyone else's life because my own life felt meaningless without the validation that came from being needed. The hardest moment of my life was realizing I was addicted to being needed, that my gift for helping was actually a trauma response to never having been helped myself, that I was using service as a drug to numb my own pain. The hatred I received wasn't just about them. It was the universe forcing me to face the truth that I was giving to get, helping to be loved, serving to matter. I'm not teaching you from some enlightened mountaintop. I'm teaching you from the trenches of this exact pattern. I know the agony of being hated for genuinely caring, and I know the humbling recognition that some of my caring was unconscious need, disguised as generosity. This work isn't about perfection, it's about consciousness. It's about being willing to see yourself fully, even when what you see isn't pretty. Imagine a world where empaths evolve from wounded helpers to sovereign healers, where helping is conscious, boundaried, and reciprocal, instead of compulsive, depleting, and one-directional. Jung believed humanity is undergoing collective individuation, a species-wide awakening from unconscious patterns. Empaths who break the helper-hatred cycle are contributing to this evolution. You're not just healing yourself, you're creating a template in the collective unconscious that makes it easier for the next empath to break free. The vision is this: communities where everyone is both helped and helper, where vulnerability is met with respect, not exploitation, where consciousness is valued, not punished. This begins with individual empaths refusing to betray themselves in the name of helping others. Your liberation is evolutionary work. So who do you become when you release the helper identity? Not what you do, but who you are. You're not hated because you're doing helping wrong. You're hated because you're doing consciousness right. Every time someone vilifies you for genuine compassion, they're revealing their own terror of transformation. That's not about you. That's about them encountering their unlived potential in your presence. You're not here to make everyone comfortable. You're not here to earn love through service. You're not here to prove your worth by fixing what's broken. You're here to help those who truly want transformation, release those who want enabling, and honor yourself enough to know the difference. The hatred stops mattering when you stop believing you're supposed to be universally loved. You're not. Conscious people rarely are. You're here to serve truth, not ego, to empower growth, not enable stagnation, to be sovereign, not safe. That's not helping. That's healing. That's not being an empath. That's being whole.